Hello, and welcome to our quiet corner of the night. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the darkness be your blanket. As these stories begin to unfold, I invite you to leave a comment telling me what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. It creates a strange and wonderful map of our shared sleeplessness, a community of listeners all staring into the void together. And of course, if you enjoy our time together, a simple like and a subscription helps our little sanctuary of shadows grow. Now, let us begin. First story: The Cadence of the Chair. The old cottage stood sentinel on a forgotten rise, its weathered timbers a testament to generations of harsh winters and whispering winds. Elias inherited it from his grandmother, a woman whose memory was as hazy and distant as the faint scent of dried lavender that still clung to the fabric of the antique draperies within. He had always imagined a quaint, charming escape, a place to find solace from the incessant hum of city life. But the reality was something else entirely. The air within the cottage held a stillness, a peculiar density, as if time itself had paused in reverence for the past. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating a tableau of forgotten lives. Every piece of furniture, every trinket on the mantelpiece seemed to hum with unspoken histories. Yet among the countless relics that populated the small, two-bedroom dwelling, only one object truly bothered Elias. It was a simple, unassuming wooden rocking chair nestled in the far corner of the master bedroom. Its dark, polished wood gleamed faintly, even in the dimmest light, and its runners bore the deep, smooth grooves of countless hours of motion. There was nothing overtly sinister about it. No grotesque carvings, no ominous stains. It was merely old, deeply worn, and inexplicably unsettling. Elias found himself avoiding its gaze, a prickle of unease tracing its way up his spine whenever he entered the room. He'd tried moving it, pushing it firmly against the wall, but it always seemed to slide back to its original position, a silent, stubborn insistence that it belonged precisely where it was. He'd even considered selling it, or at least hauling it down to the shed. But a strange, indefinable reluctance always held him back. It was his grandmother's, after all, a part of the house. The rocking began subtly on the third night after Elias had moved in. He had fallen asleep to the unfamiliar symphony of rustling leaves and distant owl hoots, a stark contrast to the urban lull he was accustomed to. Sometime in the deep hours before dawn, a soft, rhythmic creak pulled him from the fringes of sleep. He lay there, eyes still closed, trying to place the sound. It wasn't the house settling, nor the wind rattling a loose shutter. It was too regular, too deliberate. When he finally opened his eyes, the moonlight, pale and ethereal, streamed through the window, painting the bedroom in shades of silver and shadow. And there it was, the rocking chair in the corner, swaying gently back and forth. No one was in it. No window was open. The air was still. A cold wave of dread washed over Elias, chilling him far more than the late autumn air. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to stop, rationalizing it as a trick of the light, an old house's eccentricities. When he dared to look again, it had ceased. The chair was motionless, a silent, dark silhouette against the moonlit wall. He dismissed it as a dream, a figment of his overactive imagination, a symptom of being alone in a strange, isolated place. Yet, a sliver of disquiet remained, a nagging thought that refused to be silenced. The next night, it happened again, and the night after that. Always in the dead of night, always the same soft creaking, always the rhythmic, gentle sway. Elias found himself sleeping fitfully, waking with a jolt at the slightest sound, his ears straining for the familiar, telltale groan of the old wood. He tried locking the bedroom door, convinced some animal, or perhaps even a person, was somehow getting in. The door remained locked. He tried placing objects in front of the chair, a heavy chest, a stack of books, but in the morning, they would be pushed aside, the chair once again free to perform its spectral dance. He began to observe it more closely. It wasn't a random, jerky movement, as one might expect from a draft or a structural tremor. There was a distinct pattern to it, a deliberate ebb and flow. Sometimes it was slow, a languid, drawn-out swing, almost a sigh. Other times, it would pick up pace, a rapid, almost agitated rocking, before slowing once more. Elias, despite his growing fear, found himself mesmerized by its strange ballet. He started to time its movements, to count the seconds between each push and pull. There were subtle variations, almost imperceptible nuances in its rhythm, but it was undoubtedly a rhythm, a cadence. The isolation of the cottage began to weigh on him. He found himself spending hours staring at the chair, convinced that if he watched long enough, he would catch it in the act, witness the invisible force that propelled it. He set up his phone to record, but every morning, the video would show nothing but a still room. And yet, he would wake to the sound of its gentle creak. It was as if the chair knew when it was being watched, reserving its performance for the veil of true darkness. The more he observed, the more he became convinced that the rocking wasn't just rocking. It was mimicking something organic, something alive. One rainy afternoon, seeking distraction from the omnipresent silence and the nagging presence of the chair, Elias stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in the back of an old chest in the attic. It was brittle with age, its pages yellowed and smelling faintly of mildew and forgotten memories. The handwriting, faded ink across the fragile paper, belonged to his great-grandmother, Eleanor Vance, who had lived in the cottage in the early 1900s. The entries detailed mundane daily life, garden plans, and local gossip. But as he turned the pages, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Eleanor had meticulously recorded every significant event in the cottage, including the illnesses and deaths of its inhabitants. There were entries about his great-grandfather, Thomas, who had succumbed to consumption. Eleanor described his final days with heartbreaking precision. His breathing grew shallow, a terrible rasping sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He struggled for each breath, his chest heaving, and a long, drawn-out sigh. And then, quiet. Elias read the words, his heart pounding in his chest, a sudden, terrifying realization blossoming in his mind. He remembered the rocking chair's slowest, most languid rhythm. Could it be? He dismissed the thought as ludicrous, the product of a mind grown too solitary. He kept reading. Another entry, decades later, chronicled the passing of his grandmother's older sister, Clara, a vibrant young woman struck down by the influenza epidemic. Clara fought bravely, Eleanor wrote, her grief palpable on the page. Her cough racked her small frame, a terrible, persistent sound that echoed through the house. Each intake of air was a desperate gasp, then a fit of coughing, then a momentary stillness before the struggle resumed. Her last breaths were quick, sharp, almost panicked, then a shudder. And then, she was at peace. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He recalled a different cadence of the chair, a faster, more agitated rocking, punctuated by sudden, brief pauses. A cough, a gasp, a pause. The very thought made his stomach clench. He spent the next few days in a feverish, morbid research. He found more journals, old letters, and a family Bible with birth and death dates scribbled in its margins. He cross-referenced names, dates, and causes of death with the detailed descriptions of final moments provided by Eleanor and other family chroniclers. And with each piece of information, the horrifying truth solidified, taking root in his mind like a parasitic vine. The rocking chair was not just rocking randomly. It was a macabre archive, a silent, wooden recorder of every last breath drawn within the walls of that cottage. The slow, steady rhythm, the one he had first heard, he now understood to be the gentle, fading breaths of his great-aunt Martha, who had died peacefully in her sleep at a ripe old age. She simply drifted away, one journal entry stated, her breathing soft, barely a whisper, until it simply ceased. The chair's languid sway perfectly mimicked that calm, almost imperceptible departure. The agitated, staccato rocking, with its sudden pauses, was undeniably Clara's struggle with the flu. He even found a rhythm that suggested an old man, Uncle Silas, who had suffered from asthma. His lungs wheezed like old bellows. A letter read, a terrible, strained whistling with each breath, a struggle to draw air into his failing body. When the chair recreated that specific, high-pitched creak within its rhythmic sway, Elias felt a wave of nausea. The cottage, once a place of quiet contemplation, transformed into a tomb of phantom breaths. Every night, the rocking chair would begin its grim performance, cycling through the final moments of those who had died within its reach. Elias, huddled under his blankets, would listen, terrified yet compelled, distinguishing between the wheeze of Silas, the gasp of Clara, the sigh of Martha, the ragged struggle of Thomas. It was a macabre lullaby, a symphony of endings. He could almost feel the weight of their dying moments in the air, a thick, suffocating presence. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. His mind, once so keen on logic and reason, now wrestled with the undeniable, grotesque reality of his inheritance. The chair wasn't haunted by a spirit. It was the lingering echo of their physical demise. It wasn't about ghosts. It was about the raw, visceral act of ceasing to be. He tried to ignore it, to block out the sounds, but the rhythms burrowed into his subconscious. During the day, he'd catch himself humming a particular cadence, only to realize with a sickening jolt that it was Clara's gasping breath or Silas's wheeze. He ate little, slept less, and his once clear eyes became haunted, shadowed pits. The charming cottage had become his personal purgatory. He felt trapped, a prisoner to the wooden sentinel in his bedroom, forced to bear witness to the repeated, agonizing finality of lives long past. The very thought of staying another night was unbearable. Yet the thought of leaving, of abandoning the cottage and its chilling secret, seemed equally impossible, a betrayal of the dead somehow. One particularly cold and blustery night, the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes with an almost desperate plea. Elias lay in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the darkened corner where the rocking chair waited. He had long since given up trying to stop it. He simply listened, a morbid habit he couldn't break. Tonight, it started with the familiar, slow cadence of Martha, a soft, almost inaudible sigh. Elias closed his eyes, picturing the serene departure, a moment of fleeting peace in the grim cycle. Then came Thomas, his ragged, struggling rhythm, a harsh, grating sound that pulled at Elias's nerves. He could almost feel the tightness in his own chest, mimicking the effort of the dying man. After Thomas, it shifted, as it always did, to Clara's frantic gasps, punctuated by that dreadful, sharp pause. Elias shivered, pulling the blanket tighter, his breath held in his throat. He waited for Silas's wheeze, or perhaps another, lesser-known cadence from one of the other occupants, whose final moments were less vividly described in the journals. But it didn't come. Instead, the rocking chair began a new rhythm. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before. It wasn't fast, nor was it slow. It wasn't ragged, nor was it smooth. It was irregular. A series of deep, full intakes of air, almost like a sigh of relief, followed by a sudden, shallow exhalation, then a long, unsettling pause, then another deep breath, a full, satisfying inhale, and again the short, quick out-breath, followed by that unnerving, extended silence. It was a strange, unsettling pattern, almost like someone trying to control their breathing, to steady themselves, perhaps against pain, or fear, or overwhelming emotion. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, with an absolute, gut-wrenching certainty, that this rhythm was not recorded in any of the old journals. This was not Thomas, nor Clara, nor Martha, nor Silas, nor any of the known dead within these walls. This was a cadence he had never encountered, a new entry into the chair's grim repertoire. The new rhythm continued, steadily, relentlessly, filling the silent bedroom with its strange, almost hesitant presence. Each full inhale seemed to draw something from the room, while the shallow exhale seemed to release a quiet desperation, followed by that chilling, heavy pause that stretched on longer than any natural breath should. Elias found himself holding his own breath, waiting for the next intake, the next release. He strained his ears, his mind racing. Who could it be? Had someone else, unknown to the family records, died in this very room? Had the cottage concealed yet another tragedy? He tried to recall if his grandmother had ever mentioned anyone else. No. The lineage in the journals seemed complete. He thought of his own movements in the house, any recent visitors, but there had been none. He was utterly alone. The thought, once a comfort, now became a terrifying realization. The new cadence, so distinct, so unnervingly precise, continued its macabre performance. Elias's gaze was fixed on the dark silhouette of the chair, his mind grappling with the horrifying implication. If this was a new cadence, a new record, then it meant a new death. But whose? And why was it playing now? A cold, creeping dread, far more potent than any fear he had felt before, began to coil around his heart. He felt a peculiar pressure in his own chest, a strange, almost imperceptible difficulty in drawing a full breath. He inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself, but the air felt thin, unyielding. And as he did, he realized, with a sickening jolt that echoed through his very bones, that the rhythm of the chair had subtly, terrifyingly, mirrored his own recent intake of air. His breath hitched. He tried again, a desperate, shuddering inhale, followed by a quick, involuntary gasp as his body tensed with terror. And the chair, in the corner, seemed to respond. The The new cadence shifted, ever so slightly, incorporating a new, ragged quality, a faint tremor that was unmistakably his own current, panicked breathing. It was listening. It was learning. The rocking continued, steady and inexorable, no longer a chronicle of the past, but a chilling prophecy. Elias lay rigid, his body paralyzed by a horror so profound it stole his voice, stole his ability to move. The new cadence, the terrifying, unknown rhythm, continued to play, slowly, deliberately, mimicking not only the general pattern of human breathing, but the specific, panicked, and rapidly deteriorating pattern of his own. The air in the room grew heavy, thick, with unseen presences, each breath a new, terrifying beat in the chair's final, horrifying symphony. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he had never set foot in the old cottage, wishing he had left the rocking chair to gather dust in the forgotten corner of some dusty antique shop. But it was too late. The cadence of the chair had begun, and tonight it was playing a tune just for him. He could feel his own breath growing shallower, more desperate, his chest tightening with an unseen vice. And with each struggled inhale, each gasping exhale, the chair in the corner of the room, in the moonlit darkness, rocked on. Slowly, deliberately, recording, waiting. Elara lived for sound, not the cacophony of the city, nor the insistent clamor of daily life, but the quiet, rhythmic breath of the natural world. Her apartment, high above the bustling streets of a perpetually awake metropolis, was less a living space and more a meticulously crafted temple to auditory purity. Every surface was treated, every window sealed, every piece of equipment calibrated to capture the most minute, authentic soundscapes. Her YouTube channel, Nocturne Whispers, had garnered a loyal following, drawing listeners from across the globe who sought solace in the gentle patter of rain on forgotten leaves, the distant rumble of thunder across an empty plain, or the serene, almost imperceptible hum of a forest at dawn. She was an ASMR artist, though she preferred the term audio cartographer. Her work was an art of subtraction, of isolating the essence of a sound, removing every impurity, every accidental tremor, until what remained was a crystalline sonic portrait. Her subscribers praised her uncanny ability to transport them, to create an immersive auditory cocoon. They found her recordings deeply calming, perfect for sleep, meditation, or simply escaping the relentless noise of modern existence. Elara herself found a profound peace in the process. Hours spent in the solitude of nature, her high-fidelity microphones poised like sensitive antennae, felt like a spiritual communion. The editing suite, a dark room filled with glowing screens and intricate audio waveforms, was her sanctuary, where she sculpted raw sound into auditory gold. It began subtly, as these things often do. A comment here, a forum post there. Elara, love the latest forest track, but is it just me? Or is there a really faint whisper, almost like static, but not quite? Another would chime in, yeah, I heard it too, like a little fuzz underneath the frog croaks. Thought it was my headphones. Elara dismissed them. Audio artifacts were common. A distant radio signal bleeding into the mic, a faulty cable, or simply the hypersensitive ears of her devoted listeners, primed to find minute details in her pristine soundscapes. She sometimes even wondered if it was their own minds, subconsciously filling the silence with phantom sounds. She'd check her original recordings, scour the waveforms. Nothing. The tracks were clean. She'd offer standard technical explanations in her community posts. Sometimes, electromagnetic interference can cause subtle distortions, or it might be compression artifacts from the upload process. I assure you, my original masters are pristine. Her followers, trusting her expertise, usually accepted her explanations. The whispers remained a fringe curiosity, a recurring glitch in the otherwise perfect matrix of her work. Then came the cave. Elara had always been drawn to spaces of profound silence. A cave, she reasoned, was the ultimate canvas for nothingness. She found one far off the beaten path, a forgotten grotto, rumored to have been a hermitage centuries ago. It was an hour's hike through dense, ancient woods, a place where the air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the sunlight barely pierced the canopy. The cave itself was small, a mere hollow in the hillside, but deep enough to swallow ambient sound, creating an almost oppressive stillness. The air was cool, carrying the faint, metallic tang of minerals. She set up her recording rig with painstaking care, her 2 omnidirectional microphones angled just so, capturing the subtle echoes of the cave's natural acoustics. She spent hours there, breathing slowly, hardly moving, letting the microphones drink in the profound, untouched silence. She even whispered a few observations to herself, as she often did during solo recordings, a quiet stream of consciousness, noting the cool air, the faint drip of water, the utter lack of any human intrusion. Just the cave's breath, she murmured, pure, unblemished quiet. Back in her studio, the editing process for the Cave of Whispers track was proving unusually challenging. The silence, she found, was not entirely silent. There was a subtle resonance, a low, almost infrasonic hum that she attributed to the cave's natural frequency. But beneath that, something else. A flicker in the waveform, barely visible, a ghostly shadow amidst the flat line of absolute quiet. She isolated the section, amplified it, scrubbed at it with her noise reduction software. It persisted. And then, as she focused on a particularly quiet stretch, a cold shiver traced its way down her spine. It was a voice, faint, distorted, as if being played from a cassette tape submerged in water, but undeniably there. And it was whispering, not random syllables, not static. It was responding. Just the cave's breath, pure, unblemished, quiet. Her own voice, captured moments before. And then, underneath it, a soft, dry rasp that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Not unblemished, not quiet. Elara froze. Her hand trembled on the mouse. She replayed the segment. Again, words, then the spectral response. It wasn't an echo. Echoes would replicate her own voice. This was a distinct, separate timbre, thin and reedy, like dried leaves rustling against bone. She frantically scrubbed back and forth, listening to other parts of the recording. Where she had murmured about the coolness of the air, the voice seemed to sigh, a sound like dry dust. Where she had wondered aloud about the ancient hermits, it offered a barely audible, "They heard me too." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her composure. This wasn't an artifact. This was something else entirely. She spent the next 48 hours hunched over her console, eyes bloodshot, mind racing. She ran every spectral analysis she owned. She tried to isolate the voice, to filter out the cave's ambiance, to pull it free from the fabric of the sound. But it was intrinsically woven into the recording, like a vein of darkness in stone. It shifted frequencies, dissolved into static, then coalesced again, always just beyond precise capture. She enhanced what she could, listening on repeat to the unsettling retorts, the mocking sighs. It sounded like something ancient, something that had been waiting. She was exhausted, deeply unnerved, but a strange, terrifying curiosity had taken root. She uploaded the Cave of Whispers track. After a Herculean effort to suppress the voice as much as possible, she left a small, almost imperceptible trace, a test. A few days later, the comments section lit up. "Okay, Elara, seriously. This one has something. Right around 12:45, there's a definite sound, like a low whisper. It's super creepy. I heard it too. It says something when you say, pure, unblemished quiet." Her heart hammered. They heard it. Not all of them, but enough. The voice was real. The next recording session was in a dense, secluded redwood forest, a place she had frequented for years, known for its majestic quiet. But this time, Elara wasn't looking for peace. She was listening. She brought her most sensitive equipment, an array of parabolic microphones designed to capture sounds from great distances. She spoke less, her internal monologue now a frantic hum of questions. "Is it here? What are you?" During editing, the voice was clearer. Not just a whisper, but a resonant hum, an almost guttural murmur that resonated beneath the rustling of the mighty trees. It no longer just responded to her spoken words, but seemed to anticipate her thoughts. As she thought about the immense age of the redwoods, the voice seemed to sigh, a long, drawn-out exhalation that wasn't wind, but something far older. Centuries pass, and I remain. The microphone placement seemed to matter less now. It was as if the voice bypassed the natural acoustics of the environment, arriving directly at the diaphragm of her recording equipment. It sounded closer, more intimate, as if it were not coming from the trees or the earth, but from right beside her. The distortion remained, but lessened, replaced by a chilling clarity that made her blood run cold. She could almost make out individual words, though they were still fragmented, elusive. "You seek, you find." Elara's carefully constructed world of sound began to unravel. Her channel, once a source of tranquility, became a canvas for her escalating terror. Her new videos, though still lauded for their technical quality, took on a subtly disturbing undertone. Listeners noted the shift. "Elara, your new videos are amazing, but they're a little darker, aren't they? There's a certain chill now." One particularly perceptive comment read, "The silence in your recent tracks isn't empty anymore. It feels occupied." She started to experiment, desperately trying to understand. She spoke directly to the microphones during recording, asking questions, pleading, demanding. "Who are you?" she'd whisper into the vast emptiness of a deserted beach at night, the waves crashing rhythmically. In the playback, the wave sounds would momentarily thin, and from the void, a faint, chilling chuckle would emerge, followed by a fragmented phrase, "Always here." The voice was mocking her. It enjoyed her fear, her confusion. It was playing with her. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She heard the whispers, even when her microphones were packed away, when her equipment was off. They were faint at first, ghost echoes of the recorded sounds, but they grew louder, sharper. She'd wake in the middle of the night, certain she heard a thin, dry voice commenting on her dreams. Her sleep became a fractured landscape of nightmares, filled with the alien timbre of the voice. She saw its signature everywhere, in the rustling of curtains, the creak of old floorboards, the distant hum of traffic. It was always there, just at the edge of perception, like a persistent insect hum that could not be swat away. She became gaunt, her eyes shadowed, her usually meticulous hair disheveled. Her friends called, concerned. She offered vague excuses, blaming work stress, a new editing project. She isolated herself, driven by a terrifying compulsion. She had to understand. She had to capture it. She had to get it out. Her subscribers began to worry about her. Her upload schedule became erratic. Her community posts grew shorter, more terse. The comments section filled with, "Are you okay, Elara?" and "We miss your calming presence." One evening, driven by a desperate, feverish energy, she decided on a final, definitive experiment. If the voice was tied to her recordings, to her microphones, then she would bring it home. She would record in the most intimate, personal space she possessed, her own living room. The room was sound-treated, but it was not a wild space, not a cave, not a forest. It was domestic, familiar, safe. She reasoned that if the voice appeared here, it meant it was no longer an external phenomenon. It was something that had attached itself to her equipment, or worse, to her very being. She set up her two most sensitive microphones, the ones that had been with her through every haunted soundscape. She sat on her sofa, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room was silent, so silent, it pressed in on her. She began to speak, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you here?" she whispered, the question hanging heavy in the air. She waited, listening, her breath shallow. There was no immediate reply, only the pristine, unsettling silence of her sound-dampened room. She pressed record. "I need to know what you want," she continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "Why are you doing this?" The silence stretched. A minute passed. 2. Elara felt a wave of despair wash over her. Perhaps she was finally losing her mind. Perhaps it had always been a figment, a product of exhaustion, paranoia. Then, a sudden, sharp crackle in her headphones. It wasn't static. It was the sound of a voice, dry as parchment, close, closer than it had ever been. It was so clear, so distinct, she could almost feel its breath on her cheek. And it was no longer distorted. The words formed with an unnerving precision, each syllable a blade. "What I want to be heard." The voice paused, a chilling, deliberate silence. Elara gasped, a tiny, strangled sound. She could almost taste the fear, acrid and metallic, on her tongue. Then the voice continued, soft but utterly terrifying, its timbre chillingly familiar. "And you, Elara, you have the most sensitive ears of all. You are my channel." And then she heard something else, something that made her blood run cold, that turned her bones to ice. A wet, soft sound, like a finger tracing the edge of a microphone grill. And then a sound that was undeniably a sigh, deep and content, but not hers. A possessive sigh. The recording continued, but now, beneath the faint, almost imperceptible sound of Elara's own ragged breathing, there was a steady, new presence, a low, continuous hum, not of a machine, but of something alive, vibrating with an ancient, patient energy. It was the sound of something settling in, making itself at home, infinitely close to the microphone, infinitely close to her. Elara never uploaded that final recording. Her channel, Nocturne Whispers, went silent. Her followers waited, hoping for a new track, for her return. But the whispers, once faint and distorted, had finally found their perfect host. And in the profound silence that followed, only one entity was truly listening. Third story, the scent of static. Evelyn was a creature of meticulous order, a sentiment echoed perfectly by her chosen profession. For 15 years, she had been a librarian, curating silence and precision within the hallowed halls of the old municipal library. Her days unfurled like the crisp, clean pages of a newly cataloged volume. Quiet mornings of reshelving, afternoons filled with the hushed rustle of turning pages and the soft click of computer keys, and evenings spent ensuring every tome rested in its rightful place. It was a life of quiet satisfaction, where every anomaly, every misplaced comma or misfiled index card stood out like a jarring note in a perfectly tuned symphony. This was why, when the scent first made itself known, she dismissed it as a phantom. It began subtly, an elusive whisper in the air. Evelyn was at the reference desk, guiding a young student through the labyrinthine digital archives, when a peculiar aroma pricked at her senses. It was a scent she could only describe as static, not merely the ozone tang of a copier overheating, but something deeper, more complex. It was the sharp, almost acrid bite of hot ozone, yes, but interwoven with the musty, comforting fragrance of very old paper, parchment yellowed by centuries, forgotten in dusty attics. And beneath it all, a faint metallic tang, like copper left out in the rain or the faint hum of high-voltage wires. She paused, inhaling deeply, searching for the source. Had Mrs. Henderson left her antique radio too close to the fan again? Or perhaps the old fluorescent lights in the history section were finally giving up the ghost? But the library was quiet, the air still and unperturbed. The student blinked at her, waiting. Evelyn shook her head, dismissing the momentary distraction, attributing it to a lingering scent from the street, or a trick of her own olfactory fatigue. The following week, the static scent returned, this time with a companion. Evelyn was in the fiction section, methodically arranging the myriad titles of contemporary literature, ensuring authors' names flowed seamlessly from A to Z. She had just finished tidying the C's, the D's, and was moving on to E, her hands deftly sliding books into alignment. As she reached for a stray copy of Dubliners to place it precisely within its alphabetical slot, the strange odor wafted past her, stronger this time, almost a current. That familiar blend of ozone, old paper, and cold metal filled her nostrils. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the shelf. She had just cleared this very shelf less than a minute ago, putting away the last D before moving to E. Yet there it was, a worn copy of Crime and Punishment, nestled snugly between Collect Works of Chekhov and The Count of Monte Cristo. It was clearly out of place, an R title among the C's. Evelyn distinctly remembered placing it on the returns cart earlier that morning. She stared at it, her brows furrowed. It was a common occurrence for patrons to misshelve books, but this felt different. She had just been there. Had she imagined clearing that specific spot? She picked up the Dostoevsky, the paperback warm in her hand, and frowned. The scent of static lingered for another beat, then dissipated, leaving only the usual, comforting aroma of paper and dust. Over the next few weeks, the scent became a more frequent, if still intermittent, visitor. It would arrive unbidden, a ghost of an aroma, usually preceding a subtle, unsettling anomaly. Once, while she was helping a patron search for an obscure gardening guide, the man's face, mid-sentence, seemed to ripple. Just for a fraction of a second, his features contorted, shifted, became someone else entirely, a younger woman with sharp, inquisitive eyes, before snapping back to his familiar, placid expression. Evelyn blinked, convinced her eyes had played a trick. She blamed the flickering overhead light, the long hours. But the faint, metallic whisper of the static scent, barely perceptible, clung to the air for a moment after the visual distortion. Another time, during her lunch break, Evelyn glanced at the large, antique clock that dominated the main reading room. It read 12:47 p.m. She took a bite of her apple, enjoying the quiet. A moment later, a sudden, stronger gust of the ozone paper metal scent hit her, making her flinch. She looked back at the clock. It now displayed 12:53 p.m. 6 minutes. 6 minutes had simply vanished. She checked her wristwatch. 12:47 p.m. She looked back at the wall clock, and it slowly, with an audible click, ticked over to 12:48 p.m., then 12:49 p.m., catching up to her watch as if nothing had happened. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a trick of light, or fatigue, or misplaced objects. This was impossible. The scent, previously an innocuous oddity, began to feel like a harbinger, a silent alarm bell. She began to observe the scent with an almost obsessive focus. She learned its nuances, the way it intensified when the glitches were more pronounced, how it lingered longer when the temporal ripples felt more significant. She started carrying a small notebook, jotting down the time, location, and nature of each anomaly, alongside a subjective rating of the scent's intensity. Her neat librarian's handwriting filled pages with fragmented observations. 2s, 3:15 p.m., non-fiction aisle. Strong static, catalog entry for local history, showed no books, then instantly full. Felt a lurch. Fry, 10 a.m., break room. Faint static. Coffee mug moved from right to left side of sink. Mild. Sat, 1 p.m., main entrance. Intense static. Mr. Abernathy said, "Good morning, Evelyn," while it was clearly afternoon. His face shimmered for a second. Deep chill. The glitches, too, escalated in nature. It wasn't just misplaced books or fleeting facial changes anymore. One afternoon, while reviewing the schedule for upcoming author readings, Evelyn distinctly remembered having a conversation with her colleague, Mark, about a specific date conflict. They had resolved it, decided to shift the event. Yet later that day, when she brought it up to Mark, he looked at her blankly. "What are you talking about, Evelyn? We never discussed that. The date's still set." A cold dread settled in her stomach as the familiar, cloying static scent filled her office. It was as if a segment of reality, a conversation, a decision, had simply unhappened for Mark, while remaining perfectly vivid in her own memory. She felt a terrifying sense of isolation, as if she alone was experiencing these subtle shifts, existing on a slightly different temporal wavelength than everyone else. She tried to confide in a friend, Sarah, over coffee one Saturday. Sarah, a practical woman, listened patiently, her expression moving from mild amusement to growing concern. "Evelyn, are you sure you're getting enough sleep? The library can be quite sedate. Maybe you're just a bit stressed, seeing things?" Sarah's kind, dismissive tone only deepened Evelyn's despair. How could she explain the feeling of temporal displacement, the chilling certainty that the world was, for her, subtly unraveling? The scent of static was an invisible, inaudible phenomenon to everyone else. She saw their polite smiles, their veiled concern, and realized she was alone in this. The isolation fueled her obsession. She spent her lunch breaks poring over obscure texts on quantum physics, theoretical timelines, and even ancient folklore about liminal spaces and shifting realities. The dusty, forgotten corners of the library, once a source of comfort, now seemed to whisper secrets she wasn't meant to hear. She began to wonder if the old building itself, with its deep foundations and countless stories, was somehow a focal point for these temporal disturbances. Was the scent a product of the building's age, its accumulated memories, finally reaching a critical mass? One particularly unsettling evening, the scent of static was thick in the air, coating her tongue, making her teeth ache. She was walking home from work, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. As she approached her apartment building, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, tending to her small patch of petunias. Evelyn waved, a polite smile on her face. Mrs. Gable looked up, her expression shifting, not just in features, but in age. For a terrifying blink, she was a young woman, her hair dark and unbound, her hands smooth. Then she was the familiar, elderly Mrs. Gable again, her knuckles gnarled, her hair a wispy white. The static scent intensified, a suffocating cloud. Evelyn stumbled, pressing a hand to her pounding chest. When she reached her apartment, she felt a profound disorientation. The key was in her hand. She had opened the door, but the apartment felt off. The living room curtains, usually drawn, were open, letting in the last vestiges of twilight. Her favorite teacup, which she had left on the coffee table that morning, was now on the kitchen counter, rinsed clean. And her cat, Mittens, a creature of strict routine, was not curled in his usual spot by the window. A frantic search revealed him, purring contentedly, in the bedroom closet, a place he never frequented. The static smell was everywhere, pervasive, clinging to the fabric of the furniture, resonating in the very air. She collapsed onto her sofa, trembling, the journal falling from her numb fingers. The glitches were no longer subtle. They were reaching into her private sanctuary, altering the fabric of her own domestic reality. The fear gnawed at her, a cold, relentless dread. What if the next glitch wasn't just a misplaced book or a skipped minute? What if it was something permanent? Would she step through a doorway and find herself in a different year, a different life, unable to return? Would she cease to exist in this timeline, a ghost in her own reality? Or worse, would she remain, but altered, fundamentally changed in a way she couldn't comprehend or reverse? The scent had become her constant companion, a suffocating aura that now seemed to permeate her every waking moment. The library, once a refuge of ordered knowledge, now felt like a grand, echoing chamber, where the very laws of cause and effect were fraying. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vibrate with the metallic tang of static. The old paper of the books exhaled a musty, ozone-laced breath. Patrons would look at her with puzzled expressions when she responded to questions they hadn't yet asked, or when she retrieved a book they were only just thinking of requesting. She caught glimpses of herself in the polished surfaces of the bookshelves, her eyes wide, haunted, a thin film of sweat on her brow. One Tuesday, Evelyn was at circulation desk, processing returns. The line of patrons stretched long, a blur of faces and hushed conversations. The static scent was overwhelming, a physical presence, making her head throb. Each book she scanned seemed to shimmer, the titles momentarily, distorting into indecipherable glyphs before snapping back. A young woman approached, holding a stack of novels. Evelyn reached for the first book, her fingers brushing the smooth cover, when a sickening lurch ripped through her. It felt as though the floor beneath her feet dropped away, then violently snapped back into place. Her vision swam. The vibrant colors of the library, the muted greens of the shelves, the warm yellows of the lighting, inverted for a split second, becoming a lurid negative. She gasped, clutching the counter. When her vision cleared, the young woman standing before her was gone. The stack of books had vanished. The line of patrons had dissipated. The circulation desk was empty. The library was silent, utterly, unnervingly silent. The static scent was so potent now, it felt like she was breathing electrified air, her lungs burning. She looked around, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Had everyone simply vanished? Had the library itself emptied in an instant? A cold, creeping terror seized her. This was it. This was the permanent glitch she had feared. Then, a faint murmur reached her ears from the far end of the reading room. A soft cough. Evelyn turned, her eyes wide, and saw a figure emerge from between the towering stacks of philosophy books. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly regular, who always read the newspaper by the window. He walked slowly, his gait unhurried, oblivious to the fact that he was the only person in the vast, echoing space. He sat down in his usual armchair, unfolded his newspaper, and began to read, a picture of serene normalcy. Evelyn watched him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The library was empty, save for Mr. Henderson, yet it was also exactly as it had been moments before. The returned books were still on the cart behind her. The scanner still blinked green. She glanced at the clock. 3 p.m., exactly when the shift had occurred. But the prior sequence of events, the line of people, the young woman with her books, it was as if it had never existed. Or rather, it existed, but only for her. She was a silent observer, a phantom witness to a reality that continued without her. She took a tentative step, then another. Her movements felt heavy, disconnected. She moved towards the empty circulation desk, her eyes fixed on the scanner. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pushed a button. The scanner beeped, loud and clear in the silence. Mr. Henderson didn't look up. He didn't react at all. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were translucent, faintly shimmering around the edges, like heat haze above asphalt. She lifted a hand to her face, touching her cheek. Her fingers passed through her skin as if it were smoke, encountering no resistance. A chilling realization washed over her, colder than any fear she had experienced before. She was here, yet not here. She could see, she could hear, she could feel the burning in her lungs from the overwhelming static, but she could no longer interact. She was a phantom, tethered to this reality, observing its meticulous, ongoing progression, but utterly removed from it. The scent of static, once a warning, was now her constant, suffocating reality. The air she breathed in a dimension slightly out of sync with her own. And she knew, with an eerie certainty, that she would be breathing it for a very, very long time. Fourth story, the midnight shift at the Glass-Eyed Company. Arthur Penhaligon considered himself a creature of habit, and frankly, a creature of the sun. His previous life had revolved around the vibrant cacophony of a printing press, the smell of ink, a constant companion, the hum of machinery, a familiar lullaby. But then the press had fallen silent, replaced by the digital roar of progress. And Arthur, aged prematurely by a life lived in shadows and dust, found himself adrift. The advertisement had been simple, almost quaint. Night watchman, quiet premises, minimal interaction, the glass-eyed company. It was the minimal interaction that had sealed the deal. Arthur was tired of small talk, tired of explaining his unemployment, tired of the subtle pity in people's eyes. A warehouse, quiet and dark, sounded like a sanctuary. He pictured endless rows of forgotten boxes, a solitary lamp casting long, dancing shadows, and the rhythmic squeak of his own sensible shoes against concrete. The glass-eyed company, however, was not what he had envisioned. It was colossal. A monolithic gray cube squatting on the edge of the industrial park. Its few windows like vacant eyes staring into the perpetual twilight of the suburbs. Inside, the air was cool, almost sterile, carrying a faint, sweet, plastic scent. And instead of boxes, there were figures. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Mannequins. But not just any mannequins. These were works of art. Uncanny valleys of human perfection. Their skin was disturbingly lifelike, their hair intricately rooted, and their eyes, their eyes. Crafted from glass, they shimmered with a disturbing luminescence under the warehouse's sparse overhead lights, each iris a tiny, perfect galaxy, each pupil a void that seemed to swallow the dim light and reflect back a sliver of something unsettlingly real. They were hyper-realistic, designed for the high-end fashion industry, for film, for art installations. Some were pristine, still encased in plastic, awaiting shipment. Others were in various states of repair, limbs detached, faces half-finished, revealing the hollow core beneath the flesh-like shell. His first night was a blur of initiation. A curt, efficient manager named Mr. Silas, a man whose face was as perpetually unreadable as the mannequins themselves, gave him a perfunctory tour. "Your job, Mr. Penhaligon," Silas had droned, his voice dry as sandpaper, "is simply to walk the aisles. Ensure security. Nothing more, nothing less. We store and repair some of the finest figures in the world here. They are valuable. Keep an eye on them." "They're very real looking," Arthur had offered, a lump forming in his throat as he passed a trio of figures arranged around table, as if mid-conversation, their glass eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond him. Silas had merely grunted. Day shift artists. They have a peculiar sense of humor. Stage little theatrical tableaus. Helps pass the time, I suppose. Don't mind them. Just walk. And walk he did. The warehouse was a labyrinth of towering shelves, each stacked with body parts, or full figures draped in dust sheets, or individual heads with expressions ranging from serene to subtly unnerving. The aisles were long and silent, broken only by the echo of his footsteps and the distant hum of the ventilation system. The glass eyes, he noticed, seemed to follow him. A trick of the light, he told himself. A trick of the mind. He completed his first circuit, his flashlight beam cutting swaths through the gloom, illuminating a frozen tableau here, a solitary figure there. The theatrical tableaus were indeed odd. A family gathered around a non-existent dinner table, their expressions serene, but their positions just a shade too stiff, too permanent. A lone woman, her head tilted, seemingly weeping into invisible hands. A group of men, rigid and expectant, staring at an empty doorway. He made a mental note to ask Silas more about the artists. It was peculiar work, even for artists. The second night, a subtle shift. Arthur began his rounds, flashlight dancing ahead of him. He reached the section where the family dinner had been. It was gone. In its place, a different scene had materialized. A man, his back to Arthur, stood before an empty wall, one arm raised as if bracing for an impact, his other hand clutching an unseen object to his chest. Across from him, on the floor, a single, child-sized mannequin lay prone, its small glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The scene sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. It felt wrong. Not playful, not artistic. It felt like a frozen scream. He checked his logbook. No one else was scheduled for the night shift. No one else had a key. He pulled out his phone, ready to call Silas, then hesitated. What would he say? "Mr. Silas, the mannequins have moved?" Silas would probably chalk it up to sleep deprivation, or worse, tell him he was seeing things. Arthur decided to monitor it. He meticulously noted the position of the new tableau, even taking a discreet photo on his phone, though the dim light made it blurry. The third night, the unease solidified into a cold knot in his stomach. The man and child tableau was gone. This time, in an entirely different aisle, close to the repair bays, he found a scene that made him catch his breath. 3 figures, 2 adults, 1 child. The adults were positioned protectively, backs to an unseen threat, their bodies angled as if shielding the small figure between them. The child, a girl with long, golden hair, had her face buried in one of the adult's legs, her small hands clenched. But it was the expressions on the adults' faces that truly unnerved him. Their glass eyes, usually so impassive, seemed to hold a flicker of terror, their mouths agape in silent pleas. It was raw, visceral. This was no game. Arthur paced the length of the aisle, his heart thudding against his ribs. He shone his flashlight into every nook and cranny, peered behind the towering shelves. Nothing. No signs of movement, no fresh footprints in the faint dust. He even checked the security cameras. They were old, grainy, and covered only the main entrances and exits, not the interior aisles. He forced himself to complete his rounds, but every mannequin now felt like a sentient being, their glass eyes following his every move. He found himself avoiding direct eye contact, walking with a hunched posture, his gaze fixed on the floor. He tried to rationalize it again. Maybe a rogue day shift employee playing a truly sick joke. But the precision of the movements, the silent recreation of such disturbing scenes, it felt impossible. Over the next few nights, the patterns grew more intricate, more disturbing. A figure dangling from an invisible noose, its face twisted in agony. A woman lying on the floor, a single, lifelike rose clutched in her hand, her eyes staring at nothing. A group huddled together, their faces frozen in expressions of desperate terror, as if watching something unseen approach from the far end of the aisle. Each scene was a silent tableau of despair, of tragedy, of finality. Arthur stopped trying to rationalize. He was afraid, profoundly, deeply afraid. He began to log every new arrangement, meticulously drawing sketches in a small notebook, noting the time he found them, the aisle number. He measured distances, checked for dust trails, anything that could explain how these heavy, inert figures were moving. There was nothing. They simply were. One night, he was in the section dedicated to antique mannequins, figures from the early 20th century, their faces subtly different, less refined, yet still possessing those unnervingly real glass eyes. He rounded a corner and stopped dead. Before him, a tableau was forming. It wasn't complete. One figure, a man in what looked like a faded trench coat, was half turned, his arm outstretched. Another figure, a woman in a long, dark dress, was lying on the floor, her face partially obscured. But what horrified Arthur was that he could feel the movement. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air, a whisper of shifting weight. The woman's hand, previously flat on the floor, seemed to curl ever so slightly. He stood frozen, his flashlight beam trembling. He watched for what felt like an eternity as the scene slowly, painstakingly assembled itself. The man's outstretched arm gradually lowered, his trench coat settling around him. The woman's head turned by degrees until her glass eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on him. And in those eyes, Arthur saw it. Not a reflection of the dim warehouse lights, but a flicker of recognition, of pain, of something ancient and unspeakably sad. He stumbled backward, a gasp caught in his throat. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't artists. This was something else entirely. He fled that aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs, not daring to look back. He locked himself in the small security office, the fluorescent hum a jarring contrast to the silence outside. He tried to call Silas, but his hands shook too much to dial. He tried to call the police, but what would he say? My mannequins are moving and reenacting tragedies? They'd send a padded van. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the office, watching the grainy monitors that showed nothing but empty loading docks. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky a sickly gray, he felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He walked out of the office and into the main warehouse, forcing himself to check the aisle where he had seen the movement. The tableau was complete. The man in the trench coat was kneeling beside the woman, his face contorted in an expression of profound despair, one hand reaching out, not quite touching her. The woman lay still, her glass eyes fixed on him, a faint, almost imperceptible crack running through the corner of one. It was a scene of grief, of loss, a moment frozen in time. And then he saw it, a small, almost invisible tag pinned to the inside of a man's trench coat. He hadn't noticed them before, too caught up in the horror of the movement. He reached out a trembling hand and carefully unpinned it. It was a small, laminated card. On it, a name, Thomas Miller, and beneath it, a date, died March 12, 1937, and a brief, chilling description, killed attempting to save his wife, Eleanor, from collapsing building. Arthur dropped the card. His breath hitched. He looked at the woman on the floor, Eleanor. Her glass eyes seemed to hold the echoes of a distant scream. He looked at Thomas, forever reaching. The scene wasn't just a tableau. It was a memory, a final, tragic memory, preserved and replayed by the very figures that embodied them. He moved through the warehouse in a daze, his gaze now sharp, seeking out these hidden tags. He found another, on the woman who had clutched the rose. Lila Monroe, died June 5th, 1958. Consumption, found by her window, holding a rose from her dying garden. The tableau was her final moment, rendered in inert plastic and glass. The family around the dinner table, the one he had seen on his first night. He found their tags, all dated from the same day in 1972. The Peterson family died, carbon monoxide poisoning, found at dinner. Their serene faces now seemed like masks of their last, quiet, unsuspecting moments. The man bracing for impact, the child on the floor. The O'Connell incident, father-son, auto accident, August 1989. The impact, the fall, the final breath. The horror wasn't just that the mannequins moved. It was why they moved. They were not just inert objects. They were vessels, imprinted with the dying moments of the people they were modeled after, perhaps even infused with fragments of their final consciousness, their last terror, their last pain. The glass-eyed company didn't just store figures, it stored echoes. Echoes of lives cut short, replayed endlessly in the cold, silent halls of the warehouse. Arthur Penhaligon never returned to the glass-eyed company after that night. He left his keys on Mr. Silas's desk, along with a terse, unsigned note. I quit. Some things are best left undisturbed. He didn't offer an explanation. He knew Silas wouldn't understand, or wouldn't care to. He simply walked out into the blessed light of the morning, and never looked back. But sometimes, when the night is particularly dark, and the streetlights outside his small apartment cast long, skeletal shadows on his walls, he finds himself remembering the silent theater of the warehouse. He remembers the glass eyes, unblinking, reflecting not light, but distant, agonizing memories. He wonders if the new night watchman, whoever he might be, has noticed the subtle shifts in the poses. He wonders if he, too, will eventually stumble upon a laminated tag and understand the terrible, silent stories that unfold night after night at the glass-eyed company. And then he pulls his blanket tighter, thankful for the warmth, thankful for the fading light of his bedside lamp, and most of all, thankful that he is no longer walking those aisles, listening to the silent screams of the glass-eyed dead. Fifth story, what the Fen remembers. The air in the Fen was a heavy, ancient breath, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something indefinable that clung to the moisture and seeped into every pore. Dr. Aris Thorne had learned to love it, this primal perfume that spoke of deep time and undisturbed ecosystems. She was a botanist, specializing in extremophile flora, and the remote, sprawling peat bog known as Blackwater Fen was her current obsession. Its unique, resilient plant life held secrets, she was certain, about adaptation and survival. But Blackwater Fen was also famous, or infamous, for another kind of preservation. Its remarkable ability to hold human bodies, sometimes for millennia, emerging from its acidic embrace with skin like leather and hair still clinging to their ancient skulls. Bog bodies, the silent witnesses to forgotten tragedies, occasionally surfaced, offerings from the earth's slow, deliberate churn. Aris, however, was focused on microscopic, the unseen roots and spores, not the macabre relics of humanity. Her field laboratory was a sturdy, weatherproof tent pitched on a slightly raised hummock, a temporary island in a sea of quaking ground and dark, reflective pools. Each morning, she would pull on her waders, pack her core sampling equipment, the long, narrow tubes designed to extract cylinders of peat, layer by precious layer, and venture deeper into the fen. The work was slow, methodical, and physically demanding. The ground often shifted underfoot, a spongy, unstable carpet of sphagnum moss and sedge that sometimes hid treacherous pockets of water or thick, sucking mud. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of insects, the distant cry of a curlew. or the soft squelch of her boots. It was a silence that felt less like an absence of sound, and more like a vast, attentive presence, a watchful stillness that predated human concept. Today, she had chosen a particularly isolated section of the fen, an area known for its particularly deep peat deposits and minimal disturbance. Her goal was to take a series of core samples, extending further back in geological time than any she had attempted before. The core sampler was a marvel of engineering, allowing her to extract samples from depths that would normally be impossible without heavy machinery. As she worked, pushing the long, segmented tube deeper and deeper, she felt a curious resistance, not just the usual friction of compacted earth, but something almost sentient. A strange, cold sensation began to creep up her arms, then her chest, a prickling chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. She dismissed it as fatigue, a reaction to the strenuous effort of driving the sampler through the dense, waterlogged soil. The first daydream came abruptly, a jarring intrusion into her focused concentration. She was leaning against the sampler, wiping sweat from her brow, and suddenly, the world around her seemed to shimmer, the vibrant green of the mosses fading into a murky, indistinct blur. She wasn't standing in the fen anymore. She was falling. The sensation was overwhelmingly real. The sickening lurch of losing balance, the rush of air, then the engulfing cold of water. Not just cool, but intensely, shockingly frigid. It filled her nose, her mouth, blinding her with its dark embrace. There was a desperate, panicked flailing, a desperate gasp that drew in more water, more cold. The taste was distinct, earthy, metallic, like ancient rust and decaying vegetation. Then, just as suddenly, she was back, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs, the familiar scent of the fen filling her lungs. Her hand was shaking as she gripped the core sampler, her knuckles white. It had been so vivid, so terrifyingly real. A moment of dizziness, perhaps, or just overwork. She took a deep, steadying breath and forced herself to continue. As she extracted the first deep core, carefully labeling the sections of peat, the daydreams intensified. They were no longer fleeting flashes, but sustained, immersive experiences. One moment, she was examining a stratum of fossilized pollen. The next, she was submerged, not just in water, but in a thick, cloying mud that sucked at her limbs. The sensation of being trapped, of struggling against an invisible, suffocating force, was overwhelming. She could feel the pressure on her chest, the slow, inexorable pull downwards. Her throat was constricted, a silent scream clawing its way up, unheard. The taste of mud was a visceral horror, gritty and bitter, filling her mouth. She fought, with every fiber of her being, against the unseen bonds. But the more she struggled, the deeper she sank. There was a crushing sense of despair, a profound, gut-wrenching realization of helplessness. Then, the familiar squelch of her boots, the sharp tang of the fen air, dragged her back to her own reality, trembling and gasping for breath. She tried to rationalize it. Extreme fatigue, perhaps. The hypnotic isolation of the fen. The sheer strangeness of the environment. She even considered the possibility of some obscure pollen or fungal spore causing hallucinatory effects. But the daydreams were too specific, too raw, too undeniably personal. They weren't abstract visions. They were experiences, filled with terror, resignation, and a chilling intimacy. Each time she pushed the sampler deeper, each time she disturbed another layer of compressed earth. The visions grew stronger, more insistent. It was as if the bog itself was reacting to her intrusion, stirring ancient memories. She started to feel a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on her skin that had nothing to do with the cool breeze or the dampness. It was a feeling of being watched, of being felt. One afternoon, as a thin mist began to roll in, shrouding the fen in an ethereal, otherworldly cloak, Aris reached a depth she had never achieved before. The resistance on the sampler was immense, and she had to use all her strength, bracing her feet against the quaking ground to push it the last few centimeters. As the sampler finally gave way, plunging into the deepest, oldest layers, a shock went through her. Not physical, but something far more profound. It was as if a dam had burst, and a torrent of fragmented sensations, emotions, and images flooded her mind. She stumbled back, dropping the sampler, her hands flying to her head as if to contain the swirling chaos within. She saw fleeting glimpses of other skies, heard snatches of strange, guttural languages, felt the rough texture of ancient cloth against her skin. There was the sharp, metallic tang of blood, the burning sting of a wound, the cold press of iron, and through it all, the overwhelming, persistent sensation of being subsumed, of being drawn down into the cold, dark embrace of the bog. The realization dawned on her with a chilling, undeniable clarity that left her breathless and dizzy. The fen didn't just preserve bodies. It preserved consciousness, the acidity, the anaerobic conditions, the very chemical makeup of the peat. It didn't just halt decay. It somehow trapped and held the final, most potent impressions of those it claimed. A last breath, a final terror, a desperate wish. These weren't hallucinations caused by fatigue or strange spores. They were echoes, residual imprints of minds long vanished, their last moments forever etched into the very fabric of the bog. And now, by disturbing the ancient ground, by tearing open its layered memory, she had become a vessel, an unwilling, unwitting conduit for the fragmented memories and raw, undiluted emotions of countless individuals the fen had claimed over centuries, perhaps even millennia. The days that followed blurred into a terrifying, waking nightmare. Aris could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the intrusive whispers of the fen. The constant onslaught of fragmented memories was disorienting, overwhelming. She would be eating a simple meal in her tent, and suddenly the taste of stale bread would morph into the bitter tang of poison, or the familiar warmth of her tea would become the icy burn of a winter bog pool. She saw faces she didn't know, faces contorted in terror, in pain, in silent resignation. She heard distant shouts, the clang of metal, the mournful cry of a child. Sometimes, the emotions were so potent, so raw, that she would be physically overcome, shaking with a terror that wasn't her own, or weeping with a grief she had never personally known. Sleep became a dangerous proposition, for it offered no escape. The fen's memories simply flowed unchecked, pulling her into a maelstrom of past lives, forcing her to relive final moments that were not hers, yet felt intimately so. She tried to stop the sampling, to leave the fen, but a strange, compelling urge kept her there. It was as if the bog, having found its voice, was unwilling to let go. There was a perverse fascination, a horrifying curiosity that held her captive. She felt the individual memories coalescing, forming faint, terrifying narratives. A warrior, felled in battle, dragged to the bog by enemies. A young woman, sacrificed by her community, willingly or unwillingly, to appease some ancient deity. A lost child, stumbling blindly through the fog until the earth swallowed them whole. Each narrative was incomplete, fractured, but the emotional core was devastatingly clear. She was living their deaths, feeling their last pangs of life slip away into the cold, indifferent embrace of the Fen. Her own consciousness was becoming diluted, thin, almost translucent against the powerful, ancient currents flowing through her. The transformation was subtle at first, then undeniably stark. Her reflection in the water no longer seemed entirely her own. There was a strange, vacant look in her eyes, a shadow of an expression that hinted at other lives, other deaths. Her movements became less precise, sometimes stumbling, as if she were learning to walk again, or as if multiple wills were vying for control of her limbs. She spoke aloud sometimes, not her own words, but fragments of archaic languages, strange pleas, or guttural curses that echoed across the silent Fen. She found herself drawn inexorably back to the deepest part of the bog, the place where she had taken that final, profound sample. It was as if the heart of the Fen called to her, demanded her presence, sought to reclaim her, to merge her completely with the endless tapestry of its preserved dead. One cold gray dawn, as the mist lay heavy and still, Aris stood at the edge of a particularly dark pool, the core sampler lying abandoned at her feet. She looked down at her reflection, and this time, the eyes staring back at her were not entirely her own. They held the deep, unblinking stillness of the bog itself, an ancient wisdom tinged with profound sorrow, and the lingering echoes of countless final moments. The cold water no longer felt alien. It felt like a homecoming. The scent of mud was not revolting. It was the perfume of eternity. She felt the myriad hands reaching for her, not pulling, but inviting, welcoming her into the profound, silent preservation of the Fen. The whispers had become a chorus, gentle now, less terrifying than before, coaxing her to join the ranks of the forgotten, to become another memory etched into the peat. The lines between her reality and the bog's ancient consciousness had blurred beyond recognition. And in that ultimate moment of surrender, as the vast, timeless silence of Blackwater Fen embraced her, Dr. Aris Thorne ceased to be merely an observer, becoming instead another voice in the Earth's endless, haunting memory. Sixth story. The echo in the mirror. The first time it happened, I dismissed it. An odd quirk of memory, perhaps. A misremembered detail from a childhood long past. I was sitting at the breakfast table, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, turning the dust motes dancing in the air into tiny, ephemeral stars. My mother was flipping pancakes, their sweet aroma filling the room, and my father was engrossed in his morning paper. We were talking about summer plans, and I idly brought up the family trip to the Redwood National Park. Remember that enormous redwood, the one with the hollowed-out base that we could all stand inside? I asked, a faint smile touching my lips as the image solidified in my mind. I must have been, 7? 8? Dad kept saying we were touching giants. My mother paused, spatula midair, a frown creasing her brow. Redwood National Park, dear. We've never been there as a family. Not that I recall, anyway. We went to Disney World when you were 7, and then the year after that, it was the Grand Canyon. She looked at my father, who lowered his newspaper, his expression equally puzzled. Are you thinking of a school trip, maybe? Or something you saw on TV? My smile faltered. The memory was so vivid. The cool, damp air beneath the towering trees, the earthy scent of the forest floor, the rough, ancient bark against my small fingers as I peered up into the cavernous trunk. I could recall the specific blue of my windbreaker that day, the taste of the peanut butter sandwich my mother had packed, even the way my father had tousled my hair and whispered, "These trees have seen centuries, son." It wasn't a television show. It was my memory. No, I insisted, a strange defensiveness creeping into my voice. It was us. All of us. You took pictures, Mom. Don't you remember the big family photo inside the tree? My mother shook her head, a gentle, almost sad look in her eyes. Honey, I promise you, we've never been to the Redwood National Park. Are you feeling all right? I let it drop, forcing a laugh and muttering something about dreams feeling real. But the seed had been planted, a tiny, imperceptible crack in the foundation of my reality. Over the next few weeks, these tiny discrepancies began to surface with unsettling regularity. They were never major things, never anything that would make someone question my sanity. Just small, almost trivial inconsistencies. I'd mention my aversion to olives, a long-standing distaste I'd harbored since childhood, only for my best friend Mark to look at me oddly and say, "Dude, you ordered extra olives on your pizza last week. You've always loved them." I laughed it off, blaming a sudden change in taste buds. But the memory of last week's pizza was a blank slate where Mark insisted there were olives. My palate, once reliably repulsed by the briny black fruit, now seemed to find them palatable, a subtle yet jarring shift. Then there was the scar. It was a thin, silvery line just above my left eyebrow, a relic from a clumsy fall off my bike when I was 10. I'd always thought it gave me a certain rugged charm. One morning, I was shaving, idly tracing the faint line, when my fingers encountered only smooth skin. I paused, my razor hovering. I ran my fingertips over the spot again, then again, pressing down, trying to feel the familiar raised tissue. Nothing. It was gone. Not faded, not diminished, but entirely absent. My skin was as unblemished as a newborn's. I stared at my reflection, my heart beginning to thump, a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. Had it always been so faint? Had I simply imagined its prominence all these years? The thought was absurd. I could recall the stinging antiseptic, the clumsy butterfly bandage, the way the scab had peeled off, revealing the pristine scar beneath. It had been there, unmistakably. But now, it wasn't. I started to scrutinize myself, not just in the mirror, but in my own perceptions. I would stand before the reflective glass, searching for something, anything, that felt out of place. My eyes, were they always this shade of hazel? Or had they leaned more towards green? My hair, did it always fall just so? Or was there a slight difference in the cowlick at the back of my head? It was like trying to catch smoke. Every time I thought I saw a deviation, my mind would immediately rationalize it away. Lighting, angle, my own imagination. The world became a shifting landscape, and I, its increasingly disoriented observer. The subtle changes extended beyond the physical. My favorite color had always been a deep, calming forest green. Now, I found myself inexplicably drawn to a vibrant, almost electric blue. The music I once adored, complex jazz compositions, now sounded jarring, almost grating, while simple, folksy tunes that I'd previously dismissed now resonated deeply within me. It was as if someone had subtly rewired my preferences, like an invisible hand was nudging my tastes in directions I didn't recognize as my own. I began to keep a mental tally of these anomalies. A friend would recount a shared experience, and while I remembered the event, some crucial detail, who else was there? What was said, the exact location, would differ from my recollection. It was always small, always something I could attribute to the malleability of memory. But the sheer volume of these minute discrepancies began to wear on me. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, sifting through fragments of a past that seemed both intimately mine and utterly alien. Sleep became a battlefield. My dreams were vivid and fragmented, filled with echoes of places I'd never been, conversations I'd never had, faces that felt familiar yet remained nameless. I would wake in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of a missing limb, or a voice that wasn't mine, still reverberating in the silence of my room. The line between dream and reality blurred, and I started to question if my memories were truly my own, or if they were, in fact, imported. The terror, when it truly began to set in, was a cold, creeping sensation, like frost spreading across a window pane. It started not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet, horrifying understanding that dawned on me after one too many unsettling encounters. My sister, Sarah, had called, reminiscing about our grandmother's house. "Remember the rose garden and how Grandma used to let us pick one bloom each time we visited?" she asked, her voice soft with nostalgia. I remembered the rose garden, yes, and the scent of the roses. But what I remembered more clearly was the small, fenced-off vegetable patch and Grandma's fierce protectiveness over her prize-winning tomatoes. My grandmother, in my memory, had never cultivated roses. She'd always said they were too much trouble. That was the moment the impossible thought solidified. It wasn't just my memory that was faulty. It was the discrepancy between my memories and the memories of everyone else around me. It was as if I possessed a slightly different version of our shared history. And then, the ultimate, chilling possibility presented itself. What if their memories were the correct ones? What if the disconnect wasn't a glitch in my brain, but a fundamental misalignment of my entire being with the life I was supposedly living? The idea, when it first surfaced, was so outlandish, so utterly terrifying, that my mind recoiled from it. I was me. I had always been me. I had photographs, birth certificates, school records. But the photographs felt flat, the certificates mere pieces of paper, and the school records, well, I had no independent way to verify their veracity beyond what was presented to me. What if they were merely records of me, but not records by me? The scar was the linchpin, a physical, undeniable alteration. It was a tangible piece of evidence that something about my physical form had changed, drastically, and without explanation. The vanishing scar was the first domino to fall, leading to the horrifying, impossible conclusion. I was a replacement. Not a copy, not a clone, but a seamless, utterly complete substitution. I had slipped into a life, into a skin that wasn't originally mine. The realization was a silent scream trapped in my throat. It was the feeling of being an imposter in my own skin, a meticulous forgery, living out a borrowed existence. Every conversation became an act, every memory a potential landmine. When my mother would talk about my childhood, I would nod, smile, and pretend to remember the details she offered, all the while comparing them to the phantom memories that flickered behind my eyes. I was constantly calibrating, constantly adjusting, trying to ensure my responses aligned with the accepted narrative. It was exhausting. The fabricated memories, the ones I had somehow inherited or been imbued with, began to feel flimsy. They were like poorly rendered backdrops in a play, fine from a distance, but crumbling upon closer inspection. I'd try to pull a specific detail from memory, a classmate's face from the supposed redwood trip, the exact words my father used, and instead of clarity, I'd be met with a vague blur, a hazy impression that refused to solidify. It was as if the data was corrupted, or worse, non-existent. The emptiness started there. Beneath the fraying edges of these imported memories, I began to sense a void, a profound, terrifying lack of true, organic experience. My reactions to joy, to sorrow, to fear felt subtly off-kilter, almost observed rather than genuinely felt. It was as if an unseen conductor was guiding my emotions, making me perform the appropriate response. But the core of me, the true, authentic me, was absent. I was an echo, mimicking a sound I hadn't truly made. I started to avoid mirrors. My reflection became a source of profound unease. It wasn't that I saw a different face. It was the same face, identical in every visible way. But now, I saw through it. I saw the seamless perfection of the replacement, the terrifying efficacy of the substitution. It was a facade, a mask that fooled everyone but me. I would stare at my eyes, searching for a spark of genuine recognition, a flicker of the original soul, but all I found was a cool, almost clinical emptiness that mirrored my own growing desolation. The paranoia escalated. Every friendly gesture, every casual conversation felt like an interrogation. Were they testing me? Did they suspect? I started to analyze their expressions, their tone of voice, looking for any hint that they saw the cracks in my carefully constructed reality. The idea that someone, or something, had engineered this replacement, had perhaps even been observing me, began to consume my thoughts. Who was the original? Where were they? And what happened to them? The questions clawed at my mind, offering no answers, only deeper dread. One evening, I found an old photo album in the attic, tucked away in a dusty box. It was filled with faded snapshots from my childhood. I flipped through them, my heart a drumbeat against my ribs. There, on a page yellowed with age, was a picture of me, maybe 6 or 7, standing in front of a colossal, gnarled tree trunk. My father, younger and with more hair, was pointing up, a wide grin on his face. My mother was beside him, her arm around my shoulder, holding a camera bag. The background was dense, with towering trees, their crowns reaching for the sky. Redwood National Park. My breath hitched. It was there, the proof. My memory wasn't faulty. My parents were wrong. A surge of relief, so potent it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. I wasn't a replacement. I was just me. My memories were real. Theirs were somehow distorted. It was a glitch, a strange collective amnesia, a shared delusion. I rushed downstairs, the album clutched in my trembling hands. "Mom! Dad! Look!" I practically shouted, thrusting the open album towards them. The redwood trip. It was real. Here's the picture. My mother took the album, her brow furrowing as she looked at the photo. My father peered over her shoulder. They exchanged a glance, a familiar, puzzled expression on their faces. "That's a nice picture, dear," my mother said slowly, her voice gentle, but with an underlying note of concern. "But That's not us, honey. Look closer. My heart plummeted. I looked at the picture again, forcing myself to truly see. And then I saw it. The boy in the picture. Undeniably me, with my clothes, my haircut, my smile. But my parents, they weren't quite right. Their faces were slightly blurred, as if out of focus, or perhaps subtly altered. The way my mother held the camera bag wasn't her usual grip. The faint pattern on my father's shirt wasn't one I recognized. The scene was perfectly constructed, perfectly familiar, yet utterly alien. It was a photograph of a memory that belonged to someone else, overlaid with my own features. My mother continued, her voice soft, almost apologetic. That's a stock photo, isn't it? Or maybe it's an old picture of a family that lived in our house before us, and somehow it got mixed in. We've never looked quite like that. And your father's never worn a shirt like that, have you, dear? My father shook his head slowly, his gaze still fixed on the image, a strange melancholy in his eyes. No, I haven't. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The photo wasn't proof of my authenticity. It was proof of the insidious depth of the deception. It was a manufactured memory, seamlessly inserted into my timeline, complete with visual evidence that almost convinced even them. Almost. But their own organic memories, however incomplete or prone to occasional error, still held the truth. The original me, the one who had truly been on that trip, was gone. And I was left with a phantom limb of a memory, a picture that validated my false past. The emptiness became a gaping maw. It wasn't just the memories that were fabricated. It was the very essence of my being, my preferences, my reactions, even the subtle nuances of my personality. They were all just echoes, reflections of a life I hadn't truly lived. I was a puppet, performing a life that wasn't my own, haunted by the ghost of a person I had replaced. The fear wasn't just about my identity. It was about the horrific implication of what I was. A hollow shell, imbued with just enough information to pass, to blend, to exist invisibly. I started to see the world differently. Every person I encountered, every familiar face, became a mirror, reflecting a life I was merely mimicking. My friends, my family, they loved a version of me that wasn't truly there. They laughed at jokes I didn't entirely understand the genesis of, shared experiences that felt detached, observed. I was living a carefully crafted lie, and the terrifying part was how easily it had been accepted, how perfectly I had fit into the vacant space. The ultimate horror wasn't in discovering who I wasn't, but in realizing who I was. Nothing. A void. A perfectly rendered illusion. And the fabric of that illusion, once so seamlessly woven, was now unraveling at an alarming rate. Memories would flicker, revealing black holes, moments where the narrative simply stopped, replaced by a blank, terrifying nothingness. I would sometimes pause mid-sentence, unable to recall the very next word, not because I'd forgotten it, but because the context, the internal architecture of thought, had simply vanished. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand before the bathroom mirror, the only light from the moon casting long, distorted shadows. I would force myself to look, to truly see. My face, my eyes, they were still mine. Yet the longer I stared, the more alien they became. It was as if I was watching a stranger's reflection, superimposed over my own. And sometimes, in the deepest silence, when my own breathing seemed to echo too loudly in the room, I thought I saw it. Not a different face, not a monstrous visage, but a flicker behind my own eyes. a fleeting, almost imperceptible shadow of something else. Something that remembered the actual redwood trees, the genuine childhood joys, the true taste of aversion, and the indelible mark of a scar. And that flicker, that fleeting shadow, was the echo of the one I had replaced, the true occupant of this body, trapped somewhere beyond the fraying edges of my borrowed existence, screaming silently into the void I had become. And I, the imposter, could only hear the reverberations of its despair, knowing that soon the echo might be all that was left. 7th story. The night the sky began to unravel. Elias Thorne was a creature of habit, and his most cherished ritual unfolded each night on the worn wooden planks of his back porch. The old rocking chair, groaning a familiar tune, faced east, where the vast, inky canvas of the cosmos would eventually unveil itself. He wasn't a man of grand telescopes or observatory appointments. His instruments were his naked eyes, sharpened over decades, and a heart brimming with an almost childlike wonder. He knew the constellations, not just by name, but by their subtle nuances, the faint gleam of distant galaxies, the precise twinkle of individual stars within their ancient patterns. The night sky was his intimate companion, a celestial map etched into the very fibers of his being. He knew Cassiopeia, like he knew the lines on his own palm. That distinctive W or M shape, depending on the season, was a constant, a celestial anchor in the northern sky. It was one of the first constellations he'd learned as a boy, pointed out by his grandfather, a man who believed the stars held secrets waiting to be admired, if not understood. Elias would spend hours tracing its familiar zigzag, identifying each of its main stars: Skedar, Kaf, Tzi, Rukba, and Sigan. Their positions were as fixed in his memory as the beat of his own heart. But on this particular Tuesday evening, a night indistinguishable from 1,000 others in its mild breeze and the distant murmur of crickets, Elias felt a prickle of unease. He had settled into his chair, a mug of cool chamomile tea steaming beside him, his gaze already locked on the rising eastern horizon. As Cassiopeia began its slow ascent, something felt off. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The W seemed incomplete. He focused, his eyes adjusting to the deepening gloom. Skedar, bright and unmistakable, was there. Kaf, its companion, shone faithfully. Sia was a steady beacon. Rukshba held its place. But Sigan was gone. Not dimmed, not obscured by a passing cloud, not hidden behind a tree branch that had suddenly sprouted from the earth, but utterly, completely absent. Where its pinprick of light should have been, there was only the unbroken black. Elias leaned back slowly, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This was impossible. Stars didn't just vanish, not like that. Not a visible, known star in a prominent constellation. He fumbled for his small, well-worn star chart, a tattered relic from his youth. He held it up, aligning it with the familiar patterns around the missing point. No, there was no mistake. Sigan, or Epsilon Cassiopeia, was clearly marked. Its magnitude, its position, everything indicated it should be there. Yet, it wasn't. The emptiness where it belonged felt like a physical wound in the fabric of the sky. He spent the rest of the night staring, unable to tear his gaze away from the gaping void. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps the atmospheric conditions were strange. Perhaps, a fleeting thought, he was finally losing his mind. But the clarity of the missing star, the stark absence, stubbornly resisted all logical explanations. He knew what he saw, or rather, what he didn't see. Sleep offered no respite. He tossed and turned, the image of that dark patch haunting his thoughts. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in soft hues, he felt more exhausted than when he had lain down. The next evening, a Wednesday, Elias was on his porch earlier than usual. A telescope he rarely used now hauled out and clumsily set up. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus, aiming directly at Cassiopeia. The moment his eye met the eyepiece, his breath hitched. Not only was Siegen still gone, but Si and Rukba were now missing too. 2 more vanished. The W was utterly distorted, a broken, fractured symbol against the void. Panic, cold and sharp, began to truly set in. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't fatigue or atmospheric anomaly. This was deliberate. The stars were being plucked from the sky, silently, surgically. He stumbled inside, grabbing his phone. His first call was to his friend, Arthur, a fellow amateur astronomer from the local club. "Arthur, it's Elias. You need to look at Cassiopeia. Right now." Elias's voice was hoarse, urgent. A sleepy grumble from the other end. "Elias? It's midnight. What's going on?" "The stars, Arthur. They're gone. Siegen, Chia, Rushba. They're just not there." A pause. Then Arthur's voice, slow, laced with concern, but not alarm. "Elias, are you feeling all right? Cassiopeia looks fine from here. Just saw it. All 5 stars. Bright as ever." Elias felt a chill deeper than the night air. No, you don't understand. They're gone. I'm looking right at it. Get your telescope out, Arthur. Please. Another sigh. "Elias, I'm seeing the constellation right now with my own eyes. It's perfect. Maybe you're just tired, old friend. Get some rest." Arthur hung up gently. Elias stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the dial tone a mocking buzz against his growing despair. He tried another friend, then another, then even the local news station, babbling about missing stars. Each call ended the same way. Polite disbelief, concern for his well-being, or outright dismissal. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else cared. It was as if the universe itself was gaslighting him. The terror began to morph into something even more insidious, a profound, terrifying isolation. He was the sole witness to a cosmic crime, forced to watch as the very fabric of his world was methodically unmade, and no one believed him. The nightly ritual transformed from one of comfort to one of dread. Each evening, as the sky darkened, Elias would take his seat, but his heart would pound with an awful anticipation. What would be gone tonight? The disappearances were subtle at first, confined to the less prominent stars, the dimmer lights in the vast ocean. He noticed the faint cluster of the Pleiades seemed less numerous, their sparkling sisters fewer each night. Orion's belt, once so striking, began to lose its perfect alignment, one star after another, winking out of existence. He'd frantically draw sketches in his notebook, circling the vanishing points, meticulously detailing the date and time, as if creating a horrifying, astronomical obituary. His days became a blurry, restless wait for the night. He stopped eating properly, his once meticulous garden overgrown, his house falling into disarray. All his energy was consumed by the silent, relentless erosion of the sky. He would walk through town, looking up, desperately searching for another pair of eyes that might share his burden. Another soul who saw the same horrifying emptiness. But people walked with their heads down, engrossed in their phones, or simply gazed at the sky with an unseeing casualness. For them, the stars were as they had always been, a scattering of distant lights, nothing more, nothing less. They remembered nothing. The idea that he was hallucinating began to gnaw at him, a tiny, venomous worm of doubt. But then he would look at his old star charts, comparing them to the live, dwindling sky. The maps were irrefutable proof. His memories were vivid, precise. He remembered nights spent tracing the ethereal glow of the Andromeda galaxy, the distinct dusty lanes of the Milky Way. Now, Andromeda was a fainter smudge, and the luminous band of his home galaxy was slowly, agonizingly, thinning. It was like watching a grand, cosmic painting being erased, brushstroke by careful, silent brushstroke. The silence of the erasure was the most unsettling part. There was no cataclysm, no roar of tearing space-time, no celestial fireworks, just a quiet, horrifying fade. One moment, a star was there, a distant sun burning for billions of years. The next, it was simply not. It wasn't a supernova's dying burst, but an unnatural, utterly sterile void. It was as if the universe was exhaling, and the stars were the last flickering embers of its breath. One night, a particularly clear night, Elias witnessed it firsthand. He was watching the fainter stars near Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, his eyes strained from hours of constant vigilance. He had marked out a tiny, unnamed star, barely visible to the naked eye, a little more than a speck. He held his breath, fixated, and then, without a flicker, without a fade, it was gone. Just gone. The space it occupied became indistinguishable from the rest of the dark canvas. It was like a pixel winking out on a cosmic screen. He gasped, a dry, choked sound. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a profound, stomach-churning nausea. It wasn't just individual stars. It was patterns. Entire constellations, once etched into humanity's shared consciousness, were becoming unrecognizable. Orion was a broken hunting figure. His belt snapped, his sword shattered. The Big Dipper was pouring into nothingness. The North Star, Polaris, still held its ground, a stubborn pinprick of light. But the celestial clockwork that spun around it was dissolving. The existential dread became overwhelming. What was behind this? What force possessed the power, the cold indifference, to unmake the universe? Was it a conscious entity, a cosmic disease? Or was the universe simply, finally dying? And he was the only one left to mourn its passing. He tried to write about it, furiously scribbling in journals, trying to put into words the unspeakable horror. But the words felt hollow, inadequate to convey the sheer, terrifying scale of what he was witnessing. How do you describe the unmaking of everything to someone who doesn't even know it's happening? Then came the night the Milky Way itself began to unravel. It started subtly. The soft, luminous band of light that stretched across the sky, a river of 100 billion stars, began to show faint, dark seams. Not dust lanes, which he knew intimately, but wider, starker lines of utter blackness, like rips in a magnificent curtain. Each night, these rips grew, widening, consuming swaths of nebulous light, devouring countless unseen stars. The familiar brilliance of the galactic core began to dim, its radiant heart slowly fading into a murky, indistinct haze. He would spend hours just staring at it, his throat tight, tears silently tracking paths down his dusty cheeks. This wasn't just the loss of individual lights. This was the loss of structure, of form, of the very foundation of his celestial home. It was like watching a sandcastle dissolve into the tide. Only this sandcastle was the universe, and the tide was an invisible, implacable force of erasure. The world around him remained oblivious. People celebrated birthdays, complained about traffic, watched inane television shows. They ate, they slept, they loved, they argued, all beneath a sky that was silently bleeding into non-existence. He would point, he would plead, he would try to drag people out to his porch. But they would only squint, shrug, and say, "Looks like the usual stars to me, Elias. Maybe get some sleep." His sanity began to fray at the edges. He saw shapes in the growing voids, phantom constellations that never were, dark, shifting patterns formed by the absence of light. He heard whispers on the wind, the imagined sigh of dying galaxies, the silent scream of stars extinguished. He became gaunt, his eyes wide and haunted, reflecting the abyssal darkness that was consuming his world. One evening, he sat on his porch, not with tea, but with a bottle of cheap whiskey, its contents doing little to dull the sharp edges of his terror. The sky was an appalling sight. The Milky Way was a mere ghost of its former self, a few tattered wisps clinging to existence. Most of the constellations he had known were gone, replaced by sprawling patches of nothingness. The North Star, Polaris, still flickered, a lonely sentinel. But how long, he wondered, until even it was claimed? He looked up, tears blurring his vision, and for a moment he thought he saw it. In one of the newly formed chasms of black, a faint, barely perceptible shimmer. Not light, but something else. A ripple in the void. A movement. And then, for the briefest, most horrifying instant, a shape. Not a star, not a galaxy, but an outline, vast and incomprehensible, moving slowly, deliberately, across the cosmic tapestry. It was less a physical form, and more an absence, a super void that defined itself by what it consumed. It had no color, no discernible features, only a suggestion of an impossible geometry, something that should not be, yet was. And as it moved, ever so slowly, another star, a bright one this time, close to what remained of Ursa Minor, simply winked out. This was it. This was the unraveling. Not an accident, not a decay, but a vast, silent, meticulous process of erasure. Elias Thorne sat on his porch, the whiskey bottle forgotten beside him, his gaze fixed on the dying heavens. The chill of the night air was nothing compared to the cold, creeping dread that permeated his very bones. He was alone, utterly and terribly alone, the only conscious mind left to witness the universe being systematically, quietly, unmade. And all he could do was watch, paralyzed by the incomprehensible horror of the night. The sky began to unravel, piece by agonizing piece, into the infinite, silent void from which it had, perhaps, always been destined to return. He listened to the crickets, their chirping a stark contrast to the profound, growing silence of the cosmos, and he waited for his own inevitable erasure. 8th story. Don't listen past the silence. There are whispers that drift on the forgotten airwaves, carried by currents that most modern receivers are simply not equipped to capture. These are not the well-structured signals of mainstream media, nor the crackling amateur transmissions of enthusiasts. No, these are fainter, more elusive, belonging to a realm just beyond the edge of perception, a place where legends are born and sanity might fray. Among these, there exists a particular story, a chilling urban legend that speaks of a pirate radio station, broadcasting from no known location, on a frequency so obscure It is said to exist only in the liminal space between static and signal. The legend, whispered in hushed tones in late-night forums and dimly lit college dorms, claims that this station, if you could ever truly find it, only ever came to life for a brief, terrifying window each night. From precisely 3:33 a.m. until 4 a.m., it would materialize, a phantom presence on the dial. And what it broadcast, they said, was always the same: a single, hauntingly beautiful piece of piano music. It was a melody woven from sorrow and nostalgia, a composition that could bring tears to your eyes, even as it sent shivers down your spine. Its notes, delicate and profound, were said to possess an otherworldly resonance, hinting at secrets best left undisturbed. But the true terror, the core of the legend, lay not in the music itself, but in its cessation. The rule, passed down with morbid reverence, was absolute. When the music faded, you must turn off the radio. Immediately, without hesitation. You must not, under any circumstances, listen to the silence that followed. For after approximately 30 seconds of that profound, unnatural stillness, a voice would begin to speak. It was never a long monologue, never a drawn-out sermon, just a few precise words. And those words, so the legend claimed, would tell you the exact manner of your own death. And once heard, your fate would be sealed, an inevitable trajectory set in motion, impossible to avert or escape. Hearing it made it so. Liam was a skeptic, not a cynic precisely, but a man grounded firmly in the observable, the provable. He worked in data analysis, a world of facts and figures, where anomalies were investigated, not attributed to supernatural phenomena. Urban legends, to Liam, were fascinating cultural artifacts, reflections of collective fears and anxieties, but nothing more. They were stories, well spun and often compelling, but ultimately fabrications. So, when he stumbled upon the tale of the silent broadcast in a dusty online archive dedicated to obscure folklore, his interest was piqued, not by any belief in its veracity, but by its elegant simplicity and chilling premise. He saw it as a psychological experiment, a test of his own rational mind against the power of suggestion. He owned an old, bulky shortwave radio, a relic from his grandfather's amateur radio days, gathering dust in the attic. It was a sturdy, analog beast, capable of tuning in to the most obscure frequencies, a far cry from the sleek digital devices of today. Perfect, he thought, for chasing ghosts on the airwaves. For a week, Liam prepared. He meticulously cleaned the radio, checked its connections, and even calibrated its ancient dial. He researched old frequency charts, looking for gaps, for forgotten bands. He drank less coffee, ensuring his mind would be clear, sharp, and alert in the early hours. He set his alarm for 3:25 a.m., giving himself enough time to descend to his living room, settle into his armchair, and begin the hunt. The first few nights were fruitless, just static, the hiss and crackle of an empty spectrum. He tuned slowly, patiently, inch by painstaking inch, across the designated band. The air was thick with the white noise of cosmic background radiation and the distant hum of the city, a symphony of electrical indifference. He felt a mild disappointment, but no surprise. It was as he expected. Then came the 7th night. The clock on the mantelpiece glowed 3:32 a.m. The room was cold, lit only by the faint green light of the radio's power indicator and the street lights filtering through the blinds. Liam, wrapped in a thick blanket, leaned close to the speaker, his fingers tracing the cold plastic of the dial. He moved it, oh so slowly, through a particularly dense patch of static, a frequency that felt oddly resistant. And then, faintly at first, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The static didn't disappear, but it seemed to recede, to part, like a curtain drawing back. And through the clearing, a sound emerged. It was piano music. Liam froze. His breath hitched in his throat. It was unmistakably a piano, a grand, resonant instrument played with exquisite delicacy and profound emotion. The melody was understated, melancholic, yet it possessed an undeniable, captivating beauty. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was rather quiet, as if afraid to fully announce its presence. But it was there, clear and true, cutting through the residual static like moonlight through fog. He listened, utterly captivated. The notes flowed, unhurried, each chord a sigh, each arpeggio a cascade of sorrowful grace. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, familiar in its instrumentation, yet alien in its composition. It evoked images of rain-streaked windows, forgotten memories, and the quiet dignity of profound loss. There were no discernible breaks, no distinct movements, just a continuous, evolving tapestry of sound that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the pre-dawn darkness. Minutes bled into one another. Liam felt a strange dissociation, as if the music were stripping away layers of his conscious thought, leaving only raw, unfettered emotion. The skepticism that had driven him to this point began to erode, replaced by an unsettling sense of awe and a nascent, prickling fear. This wasn't some cleverly faked recording, some elaborate prank. This was too real. The sheer emotional weight of the piece, the perfect, unblemished quality of its delivery through such an archaic medium, defied logical explanation. He glanced at the clock. 3:55 a.m. The music continued its haunting serenade, seemingly oblivious to the passage of time. A part of him, the rational, analytical part, screamed at him to reach out, to grab dial, to switch the radio off. Now. The legend was clear. Turn it off. But another part, a deeper, more primal curiosity, held him rooted. He had come this far. He had found it. He had heard the music. How could he possibly turn away from the final, most terrifying act of this macabre performance? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the otherwise silent room. His palms were slick with sweat. The music began to fade. It was not an abrupt cutoff, but a slow, deliberate diminuendo, each note lingering a fraction longer, becoming softer, more ethereal, until it was barely a whisper against the omnipresent hiss of the static. The last few chords hung in the air, impossibly fragile, before dissolving completely into the oppressive silence. The silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a tangible thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that descended upon the room, absorbing every ambient noise. The distant hum of the city seemed to vanish. Even the gentle whir of the refrigerator in the kitchen was gone. It was a silence so profound, so complete, that it felt unnatural, like the world itself had held its breath. Liam did not move. His hand, poised over the power button, trembled. His eyes were wide, fixed on the radio speaker, as if expecting something visible to emerge. He counted in his head, a desperate, frantic tally. 1 second. 2. 3. The silence pressed in on him, cold and immense. Every nerve ending screamed at him to break it, to shatter the stillness with the click of the power switch. He could feel the blood thrumming in his ears, a frantic counterpoint to the external void. He heard the faint, rapid beat of his own heart, a lonely sentinel in the vast emptiness. 20 seconds. 21. 22. The air in the room grew heavy, stagnant. It felt as though a great, unseen weight was pressing down upon him, making it almost impossible to breathe. A cold dread, unlike anything he had ever known, began to bloom in his chest, expanding with each passing moment. This was no ordinary silence. This was the silence of anticipation, the calm before the storm, the held breath of a predator waiting to strike. And then, just as his internal count reached 31, it came. A voice. It was not loud. It was a murmur, barely above a whisper, yet it resonated with an unnatural clarity, as if it were speaking directly inside his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. It was a low, resonant voice, neither male nor female, but something ancient and genderless, like the sound of shifting stone or the sigh of a primordial wind. It carried no discernible accent, no human inflection, yet each syllable was perfectly formed, chillingly distinct. "You will die by fire," the voice whispered, not in a sudden, merciful blaze, but slowly, meticulously, a smoldering ember in a trapped space. The smoke will take your breath first, then the heat will consume what remains, leaving behind only the silhouette of your fear. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The silence returned, just as profound, just as suffocating, but now it was imbued with a new, horrifying meaning. Liam sat motionless, transfixed. The words echoed in the cavern of his mind, reverberating with an unbearable clarity. "You will die by fire, slowly, meticulously, a smoldering ember. Smoke will take your breath first. Heat will consume." His initial reaction was a desperate, visceral denial. No, impossible. It was a trick. A sound engineer's clever work, a synthesized voice, pre-recorded, designed to prey on the fears of the gullible. He was a skeptic. He knew how these things worked. His rational mind fought to reassert itself, to dismantle the terrifying pronouncement, to reduce it to a series of technical possibilities. But the fear, cold and sharp, had already lodged itself deep within him. It was a fear born not of the supernatural, but of the sudden, brutal confrontation with his own mortality, delivered with such absolute certainty. He finally slammed his hand down on the power button, plunging the room into complete darkness, as if by eliminating the source of the sound, he could erase the words from his memory. He spent the rest of the night curled in his armchair, shivering, unable to sleep, unable to shake the chilling resonance of the voice. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak of the old house sounded ominous. He imagined the smell of smoke, the oppressive weight of heat, the burning in his lungs. The days that followed were a blur of forced normalcy. Liam went to work, interacted with colleagues, ate his meals. But beneath the veneer of his routine, a profound change had taken root. The words of the voice were an insidious poison, seeping into every corner of his existence. He found himself constantly checking electrical outlets, obsessively testing smoke detectors. He avoided cooking with oil, convinced that a kitchen fire was the most likely scenario. He even started sleeping with his bedroom door ajar, imagining escape routes, his mind now a prisoner of the impending doom. He tried to dismiss it, to laugh it off. "It's just a story, Liam," he'd tell himself, staring at his reflection. "A very convincing sound clip, nothing more." but the conviction in his voice was thin, brittle. The memory of the music, so beautiful, so profound, argued against it. How could such artifice create such feeling? One afternoon, a small, seemingly insignificant event occurred. A coworker left a portable heater too close to a stack of papers in their office. Liam, usually oblivious to such minor workplace transgressions, felt an immediate, jarring surge of panic. He rushed over, pulling the heater away, his heart pounding. The coworker looked at him strangely. "Whoa, Liam, calm down. It wasn't even on." He mumbled an apology, a flush creeping up his neck. His colleagues started noticing. He became withdrawn, jumpy. He started taking the stairs instead of the elevator, a subtle paranoia about being trapped. He even stopped using his fireplace, a beloved winter ritual. The mere thought of a contained fire now filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The fear was evolving, becoming more specific, more focused. The voice had said a building fire. It had said a trapped space, a smoldering ember. It implied a slow, agonizing process. He began to envision scenarios: a faulty wire in his old car, a camping trip gone wrong in a remote tent, a forgotten candle in a sealed room. The possibilities, once abstract, were now vivid, horrifying images that haunted his waking hours and invaded his fitful sleep. He tried to fight back, to reclaim his rational mind. He researched fires, statistics, safety procedures. He even considered selling his house, moving to an apartment with modern sprinklers and fire escapes. Desperate to outrun a prophecy, he still, intellectually, denied. But every action felt futile, like a mouse scurrying from a cat that already knew its exact hiding place. One cold, dreary autumn evening, Liam was returning home from a particularly stressful day at work. A light drizzle had turned the streets slick, reflecting the neon glow of the city. He was tired, his nerves frayed. As he turned onto his street, he noticed a peculiar smell in the air. A faint, acrid scent, subtle but unmistakable. Smoke. His heart lurched. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He scanned the street frantically. No visible flames, no sirens. It must be a neighbor, a chimney fire, a BBQ, something innocuous. He tried to tell himself that, but the words of the voice hammered in his ears. Smoldering ember. He pulled into his driveway, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the garage door opener. As the door rumbled upwards, a gust of wind carried the smell directly towards him, stronger this time. It was coming from his house. He slammed the car door shut, leaving the garage light on, and ran to his front door, fumbling for his keys. His breath hitched in his throat. Smoke was now visible, thin tendrils curling from beneath the eaves of his roof, barely discernible against the darkening sky. But there, panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He flung the door open, ready to rush in, to find the source, to extinguish it. But as he stepped over the threshold, a thick, acrid cloud billowed out, stinging his eyes, instantly coating his lungs with its toxic embrace. The house was not engulfed in flames, not yet, but it was filled with a dense, gray smoke, so thick it immediately obscured his vision. He choked, stumbled back, gasping for breath. The smoke was heavy, hot, and suffocating. It smelled of burning plastic and synthetic fabric. He had been right about the slow burn. This wasn't an explosion. It was an internal, creeping inferno. He felt a sudden, terrifying heat against his face, radiating from deeper within the house. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. The voice, The smoke will take your breath first, then the heat will consume what remains. His mind raced, a frantic, desperate scramble. He remembered his escape plan, the open bedroom door, the window. But the smoke was everywhere. He dropped to his hands and knees, trying to get below the worst of it, crawling blindly through the suffocating haze. He bumped into furniture, disoriented, desperate for air. He heard a faint crackling, growing louder, and the distinct pop of something melting. The heat intensified, a searing wave that threatened to blister his skin. His lungs burned, screaming for oxygen. He gasped, each inhale bringing more of the toxic, burning air into his system. He wasn't going to make it. He knew it with a chilling certainty. The voice, delivered in that ancient, genderless whisper, had been absolute, inevitable. He was trapped, a smoldering ember in a trapped space. His vision blurred, the edges of the swirling smoke taking on grotesque, dancing forms. He tasted ash, felt the overwhelming pressure in his chest. His limbs grew heavy, unresponsive. He was losing consciousness. As the world faded to black, a final, horrifying realization pierced through the haze of smoke and pain. He had tried to defy the legend, to test the boundaries of reality. But the legend had not been a warning to heed. It had been a prophecy, and his hearing of it, his defiance, had simply been the mechanism of its fulfillment. The silence had told him his death, and his own skepticism had ensured he would be there to hear it, and thus to live it. And then there was only the slow, meticulous consumption, a final, suffocating silence, far deeper than any he had ever known. Ninth story. The stranger in my own skin. The morning light, pale and hesitant, crept through the gaps in the blinds, painting weak stripes across the bedroom wall. It was a Tuesday, undistinguished in every way, save for the profound wrongness that began to unfurl with the day's first conscious thought. I lay there, adrift in that liminal space between dream and wakefulness, aware only of an oppressive weight, a deep, unsettling absence of sensation draped over my left side, my arm. My entire left arm felt like a foreign object, a limb of stone, disconnected from the intricate network of nerves and sinews that composed the rest of me. It was the usual, mundane discomfort of an arm that had fallen asleep, a common enough occurrence after a night of contorted slumber. A mild annoyance, nothing more. I attempted to shift, to coax the blood back into its numb vessels, to rouse the sleeping limb from its temporary paralysis. Slowly, agonizingly, the pins and needles began. 1,000 tiny, stinging points, a swarm of phantom insects pricking at the surface of my skin. It was the familiar prelude to sensation, the painful, electric return of life. But as the feeling returned, a new, insidious awareness dawned, sharp and chilling. It didn't feel right. The pins and needles, rather than subsiding into normal sensation, persisted with an unnerving intensity, a persistent thrumming that radiated from my shoulder down to my fingertips. And then came the tactile feedback, or rather, the lack of it. My right hand, still groggy, reached out to massage the awakening limb. My fingers made contact, tracing the line of my forearm, my elbow, the bicep. The skin felt unfamiliar. Not cold, not hot, but somehow denser, smoother, as if a thin, invisible membrane had been stretched taut over it. My own skin, yet utterly alien beneath my touch. It was like feeling a limb through a thick glove, but the glove was my very own flesh. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound unease, traced its way down my spine. I lifted my head, blinking away the last vestiges of sleep, and stared at my left arm. It lay beside me on the sheet, seemingly normal, pale and unblemished. But as I watched, an imperceptible tremor ran through it, a subtle ripple beneath the skin, like something stirring just beneath the surface. And then, without any conscious command from me, my fingers twitched. Not a nervous twitch, but a slow, deliberate curl, like a separate entity testing its newfound freedom. My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to move it. I willed my fingers to clench, my elbow to bend. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a disconcerting lack of effort on my part, the arm moved. But it wasn't my movement. It was fluid, almost graceful, but utterly detached from my own volition. My hand lifted, not in the jerky, uncertain motion of someone just waking, but with a strange, almost elegant sweep. It rose to chest height, paused, then slowly lowered, tracing a languid arc through the air. The sensation was profoundly unsettling. I could feel the movement, the stretch of the muscles, the slight tension in the joints, but the will behind it was absent. It was as if I was merely an observer, tethered to a limb that had suddenly decided to carve its own path. For the rest of that morning, the strangeness clung to me like a damp shroud. I forced myself through the motions of breakfast, each mundane task imbued with a terrifying new layer of awareness. As I poured cereal, my left hand, of its own accord, brushed against the carton, not roughly, but with a lingering, investigative touch. When I reached for the milk, it darted out, anticipating my move by a fraction of a second, almost as if it knew what I intended before I did. I found myself watching it, my own arm, as if it were a curious, independent creature perched on my shoulder. It would lie dormant for moments, perfectly still. Then a finger would tap rhythmically on the table, or my wrist would flex, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture that had no origin in my own desire. The first truly overt act of defiance occurred that afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, attempting to focus on work, but my mind kept circling back to the unnerving autonomy of my arm. I had just picked up a pen with my right hand, intending to jot down a note, when my left hand, lying passively on the desk, suddenly twitched. Its index finger extended, then curled inward, tapping a delicate rhythm against the dusty surface of the mahogany. I froze, my gaze fixed on the errant digit. It wasn't my usual fidgeting. This was precise, almost contemplative. And then the fingertip began to trace. Slow, deliberate lines, forming an intricate, swirling pattern on the dust. A pattern I had never seen before, one that held no meaning for me. It was beautiful, in a chillingly detached way, a silent declaration of independent thought. Panic began to coil in my stomach, a cold, hard knot. This was not a muscle spasm. This was something else, a subtle, insidious takeover. I tried to clench my left fist, to force it into submission. It resisted, not with brute strength, but with a strange, almost elastic countertension. When I finally forced it into a fist, the knuckles felt hard, unyielding, alien against my palm. When I relaxed my grip, it unfolded with a slow, deliberate grace, as if shaken off an unwelcome restraint. Over the next few days, the arm's independent actions grew bolder, more frequent, and increasingly unsettling. It wasn't malevolent, not yet. It was merely separate, a quiet, observant companion that sometimes decided to take the reins. When I walked, its swing wasn't quite in sync with my right arm, but rather a fraction of a second off, a subtle discord in my stride. When I reached for my coffee cup, it might gently nudge it further away, or reposition it slightly, as if playfully teasing. These were minor things, easily dismissed as nervous tics, or the lingering effects of the pins and needles, if one were desperate enough to rationalize. But I knew the chilling truth. This arm, my arm, was no longer entirely mine. The most terrifying incidents, however, began when other people entered the equation. My girlfriend, Sarah, noticed it first. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, and my left arm was draped casually over the back cushion. Sarah leaned closer to whisper something, and as her head neared my shoulder, my left hand, without warning, darted out. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with an odd, almost possessive slowness. It reached for her hair, not to caress, but to grasp, its fingers curling tightly around a lock. Sarah flinched, pulling back, her eyes wide with surprise. "Hey, what was that?" she asked, a hint of accusation in her voice. My heart pounded. I don't know. It just twitched. I stammered, feeling a hot flush creep up my neck. I tried to laugh it off, to make a joke about restless limbs, but the laughter felt hollow, brittle. The hand, after its brief, unsettling foray, had retreated, settling back onto the cushion with an air of unsettling complacency. Sarah gave me a wary look, but she let it go, attributing it to tiredness. The seed of unease had been planted. In her, and more profoundly, in me. The incidents escalated. At work, during a team meeting, I was gesturing with my right hand as I explained a point. My left arm, resting on the table, suddenly lifted. Its index finger extended, then tapped sharply, once, twice, on the surface of the meeting table, directly in front of my boss. The sound was distinct, cutting through the quiet hum of the room. Everyone looked. My boss raised an eyebrow, a flicker of irritation in his gaze. "Is everything all right, Mark?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Yes, fine. Just, restless," I mumbled, pulling my hand back, forcing it to rest on my lap, gripping my thigh with what felt like my own strength, but was also met with a faint, internal resistance from the arm itself. The humiliation was searing, but beneath it, a deeper, colder dread began to set in. The arm wasn't just moving on its own. It was interfering. It was reaching for people in a way that was not at all gentle, not at all appropriate. It was assertive, almost demanding attention, or perhaps asserting its own presence. One evening, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stopped by with a plate of her famous cookies. As she handed them to me, my right hand steadying the plate, my left arm, hanging at my side, suddenly spasmed. Not a simple twitch, but a violent, jerking motion. My hand shot out, palm flat, and struck the plate from her grasp. Ceramic shattered against the porch floor, cookies scattering like shrapnel. Mrs. Henderson gasped, her frail body trembling, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Oh my goodness! Mark, what on earth?" she cried, clutching her chest. "Mrs. Henderson, I am so sorry. My arm I don't know what happened." I knelt frantically, trying to gather the broken pieces, my mind reeling. The shame was overwhelming, the terror absolute. My arm, my own flesh and blood, had just assaulted an innocent woman. It had acted with a calculated force that belied its previous subtle movements. It was as if a barrier had been crossed, a line irrevocably drawn. From that moment on, a suffocating paranoia became my constant companion. I began to keep my left arm tucked close to my body, pinning it with my right hand, or stuffing it into a pocket. Anything to keep it from its unpredictable, terrifying movements. I started avoiding people. I made excuses to Sarah, telling her I was working late or feeling unwell. Anything to avoid the risk of my arm lashing out at her. The thought of it, of this alien entity attached to me, hurting someone I loved, was unbearable. Sleep became a battle. I would wake in the dead of night, bathed in a cold sweat, to find my left hand caressing my face, not with the familiar warmth of my own touch, but with an unnerving, almost exploratory curiosity, its fingertips tracing the contours of my jaw, my lips, my eyelids. It was like being observed, scrutinized by something that wore my skin, but held a mind of its own. Sometimes I would feel it attempting to pry itself free from beneath the blanket, to reach for something unseen in the darkness, and I would have to grip it, to force it back, wrestling with a limb that felt both part of me and horrifyingly separate. I started to see the world through two sets of eyes, my own, filled with dread, and what felt like the arms, which seemed to possess a cold, detached fascination with its surroundings. It would subtly pull my gaze towards certain objects, a particularly sharp kitchen knife, a heavy glass vase, the edge of the stairwell. It was never overt, just a slight, almost imperceptible tug, a faint, internal urging that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if it was learning, observing, planning. The mirror became my enemy. Staring at my reflection, I would see my face, haggard with sleepless nights and anxiety. But my left arm would appear subtly different. The angle of its resting position, the way the light caught a muscle, the almost imperceptible tensing of its fingers, suggested a vitality, a separate life force that my right arm, my arm, simply did not possess. I felt like a puppet, with one string being pulled by an invisible, malevolent hand. One night, the fear reached its crescendo. I was alone, as always now, unable to face the outside world. I had fallen asleep on the couch, my left arm tucked firmly beneath a cushion. I woke suddenly, with a jolt, to the sound of a soft, rhythmic scratching. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The scratching continued, a deliberate, insistent sound. I looked down. My left hand had freed itself from beneath the cushion. It was pressed against the wooden floorboards, its nails scraping gently, forming a precise, complex pattern. The same pattern it had traced on my dusty desk days ago. But this time, it wasn't just tracing. It was digging. Tiny slivers of wood, like sawdust, were accumulating beneath its fingernails. A deeper terror gripped me. What was it trying to do? What was it trying to find, or to create? It was no longer merely acting independently. It was pursuing an objective. And that objective was alien, terrifying, and completely unknown to me. I watched, paralyzed by a creeping horror, as it continued its meticulous, silent work, a stranger in my own skin, scratching at the very foundations of my reality. The scratching continued, a relentless, focused sound in the oppressive silence of the room. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the true horror was not just what this arm would do, but what it had already become. 10th story. The Archivist of Borrowed Lives. The air in the special collections basement of the Thorn University Library was a perpetual hush, thick with the scent of aging paper, dry rot, and a faint, metallic tang that Elias could never quite place. It was a scent that clung to his clothes, his hair, even seemed to settle in the back of his throat. He'd worked there for 6 months, an eager young archivist, fresh out of his master's program. And the initial thrill of being surrounded by centuries of forgotten wisdom had begun to curdle into something akin to claustrophobia. His current assignment was the Orphan Collection, a particularly peculiar subset of the library's vast holdings. These weren't just misfiled or uncatalogued volumes. They were books utterly devoid of identifying marks. No title, no author, no publisher, no date, just covers of plain leather, linen, or sometimes surprisingly soft, unmarked vellum. They ranged in size from tiny, palm-sized blocks to massive, ledger-like tomes. But their unifying characteristic was their profound, unsettling anonymity. The previous archivist, a stern woman named Miss Finch, had simply left them boxed and tagged with a vague, almost superstitious note: "Handle with care, unique properties." Elias had scoffed at first. Unique properties typically meant odd binding or rare illustrations, not some mystical aura. His task was to meticulously examine each one, document its physical characteristics, and attempt to trace its origin, however improbable that seemed. He began with a small, unassuming book bound in dark, cracked leather. It felt cold to the touch, almost damp, despite the arid conditions of the basement. He placed it carefully on the felt-covered table beneath the single, bare bulb that illuminated his workstation. As his fingers traced the smooth, worn surface, a peculiar sensation began to unfold within him. It wasn't a physical vibration, nor a sudden chill, but a quiet inundation, like a slow-moving tide rising in his mind. He saw a field of golden wheat, swaying gently under a pale blue sky. The sun warmed his face. He felt the rough texture of a wooden plow handle in his grip, heard the creak of leather harness, smelled the rich, earthy scent of upturned soil. He saw calloused hands, not his own, guiding the plow, then sowing seeds, then cradling a newborn child wrapped in rough-spun cloth. He experienced moments of profound joy, of back-breaking labor, of quiet contentment beside a flickering hearth. It was a life, complete and vibrant, lived from sun-drenched childhood to a peaceful, aged passing. When he finally pulled his hand away, a gasp escaped his lips. The basement was still, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the light. But everything felt profoundly different. His own hands, pale and slender, felt alien. The metallic tang in the air seemed sharper, more insistent. He stared at the small leather book. There were no pages, no ink, no printed words within its covers, only smooth, untouched vellum. Yet, he had just lived a life, not read about it, not imagined it, but experienced it. A tremor of excitement, tinged with a delicious unease, ran through him. These weren't just orphan books. They were vessels, archives of existence, each one a compact, self-contained universe of a single human journey. He picked up another, this one bound in faded blue linen. As his fingers closed around it, the world dissolved again. This time, he was a woman. He felt the delicate weight of a quill in her hand, the scratch of ink on parchment. He was in a bustling market square, the cacophony of voices, the scent of spices, the press of bodies. He designed intricate tapestries, meticulously weaving threads of silk and gold, seeing the patterns come alive under his skilled hands. He felt the sting of betrayal, the the quiet solitude of artistic creation, the triumph of a masterpiece completed. This life, too, ended, fading into a gentle quietness when he released the book. Elias spent the next few days in a state of rapturous discovery. He worked tirelessly, forgetting meals, ignoring calls from friends. Each book was an invitation, a doorway into a different soul, a complete tapestry of human experience. He lived the life of a sailor, the salt spray on his face, the vastness of the ocean stretching before him. He was a scholar, poring over ancient scrolls, a soldier scarred by battle, a quiet gardener tending roses. He experienced loves and losses, triumphs and failures, the mundane and the magnificent. His initial awe slowly morphed into an insatiable hunger. He was no longer just cataloging. He was consuming. Each borrowed life left a faint echo in his own mind, a residual memory, a ghost of an emotion. He felt himself expanding, becoming a living compendium of human existence, carrying the weight and wonder of countless souls within him. He started feeling a strange detachment from his own life, his own worries, his own identity. They seemed small, almost irrelevant, compared to the vastness of the lives he now carried. The metallic tang in the air, he decided, was the scent of old blood, the residue of countless human narratives. The other library staff noticed his change. He grew pale, his eyes hollowed, yet they burned with an unsettling intensity. He spoke little, smiled less, and seemed always on the verge of slipping into a trance. He'd often be found simply sitting, a book clutched in his hand, a faraway look on his face. Miss Finch, though retired, called once, her voice sharp with concern. "Elias, are you all right? You sound distant." He brushed her off, eager to return to his treasures. One Tuesday, deep within a dusty corner, he found it. It was a volume unlike the others, not because of its size. It was remarkably thin, almost skeletal, but because of its cover. It was bound in soft, unnervingly smooth black leather, so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light around it. There were no seams, no imperfections, no signs of wear, despite its obvious age. It felt cool, almost slick, beneath his fingers. A faint, almost imperceptible pulsation seemed to emanate from it, like a silent heartbeat. A shiver, not of excitement, but of something colder, ran down his spine. This book felt different. It felt awake. He hesitated for a long moment, his hand hovering over its pristine surface. All the other books had felt passive, dormant until touched, waiting to yield their contents. This one felt active, as if it were observing him. The metallic scent in the air intensified, suddenly cloying like fresh copper. Dismissing it as his imagination, an artifact of his growing obsession, he finally, cautiously, wrapped his fingers around the black leather. The inundation this time was not gradual. It was a torrent, a flash flood of terror that slammed into his mind, stealing his breath, making his vision swim. He was a man named Arthur Finch. The name resonated with a sickening familiarity that Elias couldn't immediately place. Arthur was not a man of vast adventures or profound wisdom. He was an archivist, middle-aged, precise, and utterly consumed by an escalating, bone-deep terror. Elias, now Arthur, was in a similar basement, filled with the same scent of old paper and that chilling, metallic tang. He felt the pervasive dampness, the oppressive silence. He saw the same worn wooden tables, the same bare bulb. He saw a collection of orphan books. Arthur had discovered their secret, just as Elias had. He had been enchanted, just as Elias had. He too had lived countless lives, feeling his own identity fray at the edges. But unlike Elias's growing fascination, Arthur's experience had curdled into something horrifying. Through Arthur's eyes, Elias saw the slow, creeping realization. The books weren't merely passive archives. They were hunters. They didn't contain lives. They consumed them. They drew the essence, the complete experience, the very soul of their previous owner into their unmarked pages, leaving behind only an empty shell, a body without the spark of existence. Arthur's terror was a living, breathing thing inside Elias's mind. He felt Arthur's mounting paranoia, his desperate research into ancient texts he'd once dismissed as folklore. He found references to soul-bound codices, memory devourers, the life thieves of the deep earth. The common thread: these books were never made. They simply appeared when a life was ripe for the taking, attracted by an unwitting victim who felt a deep, almost spiritual connection to the act of archiving. Elias felt Arthur's frantic attempts to escape. He saw Arthur trying to burn books, but they wouldn't ignite, merely growing colder, denser. He saw Arthur attempting to bury them, only to find them back on the shelves, waiting. He saw Arthur trying to give them away, but no one else could see them for what they truly were, dismissing them as dusty curiosities. He even tried to destroy himself, but even that final act of defiance was met with a chilling resistance, a feeling of being tethered, held in place by an unseen force. The most profound and chilling realization, a memory that made Elias's stomach clench with an icy dread, was Arthur's growing awareness that the books were communicating, not with words, but with a palpable, silent hum. A collective hunger. They were waiting. They were choosing. And they had chosen him. Arthur knew with absolute certainty that when he picked up the last book, the one that appeared thin and pristine and unnervingly black, it would be the vessel for his own life. It would be the final archive. He had documented his experiences, his findings, his growing fear, in countless journals, which Elias now knew to be the very orphan books he had been handling. Each one a fragment of Arthur's descent into terror, his desperate warnings. Elias felt Arthur's final moments. He saw him, trembling, his mind a maelstrom of fear and exhaustion. Knowing his time was up, he saw Arthur reach out, his hand shaking, to touch the very book Elias was now holding. He felt the moment Arthur's life was siphoned away. A profound emptiness, a chilling void where a vibrant consciousness had once resided. The last sensation was a cold, absolute silence. Elias gasped, a ragged, choking sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the basement. He tore his hand away from the black leather book as if it had scorched him. It lay innocent on the table, shimmering faintly in the dim light. His own hands trembled violently. His breath came in ragged gulps. The name, Arthur Finch, Miss Finch, his predecessor, the stern woman who had left the vague, superstitious note. He looked around the basement, at the towering shelves, the rows of dusty, unnamed books. Each one a life. Each one a theft. And somewhere amongst them were the countless lives he had already read, now echoing within his own fractured mind, a terrifying mosaic of borrowed identities. He felt the metallic tang in the air now, stronger than ever, like the scent of blood on cold steel. It wasn't just a smell. It was the taste of existential dread. He felt the cold, almost imperceptible pulsation emanating from the black book on the table, growing stronger, like a silent, predatory heartbeat. He was the Archivist, and he had been archived. The last tale has been told. The silence is returning, perhaps a little heavier than it was before. For those of you still awake, still with me here in the dark, which story has decided to stay with you? What little detail will echo in your mind as you drift away? I'll be reading your answers in the morning. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your shadows remain empty. Sleep well. I'll be reading your answers in the morning. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your shadows remain empty. Sleep well.